Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. It's Tuesday, which kind of officially kicks off game week. We've broken down the previous game, and we're now looking ahead to the next opponent. And that's going to be a big topic of conversation today. I'm Brian Driscoll. That's Trevor Trowbridge right there. Y'all know who that is. And today, Trev, we've got several things we're going to discuss. We're going to kick the show off here in a few. Sort of looking at what's at stake for Notre Dame in this game against Virginia. And when you're playing a team like Virginia, who's a scrappy, decent team, they're 5-4, coming off of a big win. They beat a top 25 Pitt team last week at Pitt. As you mentioned, I believe in your article, you talked about how they're 3-1 on the road, right? And this is a scrappy team, but it's not a team that should beat Notre Dame. And so the focus is going to be on, what does Notre Dame have to prove? What can Notre Dame do? So we'll talk about that at the beginning of the show. Segment 2 of today's show, we'll actually take a dive into Virginia. We'll look at their offense, their defense, what we like about it, what things Notre Dame should be able to take advantage of. And then part 3 of today's show is going to take a look at tonight's college football playoff rankings, Trevor. And obviously those come out this evening around 8:30. We're going to go live at 8:30 is our plan. Most likely the show won't start on time. Not our show. I'm referring to the college football playoff show won't start right at 8:30 because it's in between 2 basketball games, and usually those run a little bit long. We will, if it's looking like the game is going to finish early, we will start early and kind of get going, and we'll preview things a little bit, and then we'll give you guys a live reaction to all the rankings, and then, of course, after we give that live reaction to all the rankings, we'll then break down what it means for Notre Dame. So that's what's kind of on the docket today with us here on the big show. So Trevor, boy, I tell you what, man, this Notre Dame team keeps playing red hot football. I'm excited to talk about this team, and we're going to find out if they can keep it rolling. And as we look at this game, it's a game that Notre Dame should win convincingly, and it's certainly a game that when you look at the betting lines, Notre Dame's a 23-point favorite. So the expectation is that Notre Dame is going to win big, which I think is perfect timing for us to talk about our friend of the show, MyBookie.
It sure is, Brian. Notre Dame has been red hot lately, which has been awesome for me because I've been using MyBookie to bet on Notre Dame's alternate spread, which has actually hit over the past couple of weeks, which has been a lot of fun. So unfortunately for me, I have already used up my bonus bet, which I got from my deposit bonus. But for any of you who are wondering how to do that, when you sign up for MyBookie, all you have to do is type in promo code IRISH, IRISH. And what that's going to do for you is it's going to double your deposit bonus. So, for an example, if you put in $10, MyBookie is going to then reward you with $10 worth of bonus bets, so on and so forth. I believe that there is a cap to that number. I'm not 100% sure what that is, but I don't know if you put in $1,000. I don't know if they're going to double your deposit up to that much. However, just signing up to play, they are already going to reward you for signing up with MyBookie. It's one of the best sports books out there. It gives you the tools that you need to win. They also allow you to enroll in their loyalty rewards program, which is going to help you earn extra cash just for throwing down some bets, which is something that I've already reaped the benefits of. This Thursday, there's going to be another Thursday night football game coming up, which me and one of my buddies always link up to watch on Thursdays, and there's no better way to do that than with MyBookie risk-free Thursdays. So they have a lot going on over at MyBookie. Be sure to check them out. They're the sports book that gives you control and rewards you for every moment of play.
So Trevor, before we start, I did want to make up for something we did not do last night. So last night, we were so excited about the show last night. Just breaking down the Notre Dame. Gosh, the biggest game of my childhood was the Florida State game. Like, I remember the Miami game in 88, and I was 10. That was kind of my first year as a Notre Dame fan, and that was obviously a big game. But, like, when I was old enough to really appreciate it was the 93 season when they went, 12-1 and beat Florida State. And so I've always had, as I've said this before, I've always had a lot of respect for Florida State. I grew up with Florida State as a kid, Trevor, in my life. There's like 15 plus years in a row where Florida State finished in the top 5 every single year, And so there's a lot of respect there. So to watch Notre Dame beat them 52-3 and like I know they're down, but it's still Florida State. So I enjoyed that. And then, of course, during the show, Nolan James commits Notre Dame. We broke all that down. And I dropped the ball, Trevor. I dropped the ball. There were 4 super chats that we did not get to. But what I did is I did screenshot those 4 chats. And we are going to, you and I are just going to quickly address them here and bring them up before we get started. And again, I apologize to Joe and Tyler and Cody Shreve because we did not get to those super chats last night. But we are going to get to them because you guys did give us those super chats. We greatly appreciate it, and I don't want you guys to feel like we don't value those. And so I do feel bad about that. Cody Shreve with a super chat said, "Happy Veterans Day." Of course, yesterday was Veterans Day, and again, we really thank all of you who have the courage and the desire and the passion and the patriotism and the concern for fellow man to serve in all capacities in which service is given. I come from a military family. My wife used to be a firefighter. So grandfather was a police officer. My uncle was a police officer. My uncle, my mom's side was in the Marines. My grandfather fought in World War II in the Battle of the Bulge, actually, which I did not find out till after he passed away because he did not like to talk about it. But we love all y'all veterans, and we appreciate y'all. And I know we have a lot of you guys in our chat, and so we greatly appreciate that you guys are part of this community. And just know that you are appreciated, valued, and respected by us here at Irish Breakdown. So thank you again for that reminder, Cody. Joe Papiti with 2 super chats. First one from Joe is, "Go Irish, love beating Florida State. My take, A, offense still hasn't played their best game. And B, Al Golden is having the best years of DC, in my opinion." Thoughts? Well, I'll tell you, I'll go backwards, Trev. There's no doubt Al Golden is the best coordinator in college football right now. I mean, when you consider where Notre Dame ranks defensively in just about every major category, somebody on our board today, PQ Whatado, put a stat up about stop rate and talked about how it was from Max Olson from ESPN put this together. And Notre Dame has the number 2 stop rate in all of college football behind only Ohio State, and they are right behind Ohio State. Put it like this: they're closer to Ohio State than they are to number 3 Tennessee. So they're 0.4 ahead of Tennessee. They're 0.1 behind Ohio State when it comes to stop rate. They're also number 2 in points per drive. They're giving up less than 1 point per drive. You look at those are you look at the other metrics. The Fermo efficiency index last week. I don't know if they've updated. Let me see if they've updated. Yeah, they've updated their stuff. They have Notre Dame as the number 5 defense in all of college football. You've got the football power index. When you look at their efficiency numbers, they have Notre Dame's defense ranked. Let's see here. They have Notre Dame ranked number 3 overall. So all of the computers obviously really like Notre Dame a lot. But then there's also the raw data, Trev. And it's not just like, oh, they're doing good relative to their competition. That's also true. That's where the efficiency comes from. But they also rank number 3 in all of college football in points per game at 11.1. Only Ohio State and Army rank higher. You look at them in total defense, they rank 7th in total defense this year, giving up 274.6 yards per game. And as is always the case, half of the teams ahead of them are Big Ten teams because the Big Ten has no offense to speak of in their league. And that's why you always have all these teams. They're 4th in college football in yards per play, behind Tennessee, Indiana, and Texas, ahead of Ohio State. And, of course, their pass defense, Trevor, this year has once again been outstanding. They're 2nd in yards per game. They're 2nd in quarterback rating. They've had twice as many interceptions this year as they've allowed touchdowns. They're 4th in fewest yards allowed per attempt. And for the second straight year, or potentially for the second straight year, they could be a top 2 team in completion percentage. Last year, they were number 2 behind Florida State. This year, they're number 1. They've actually taken off 5%. They were number 2 last year, Trevin. So far, they've taken off 5 percentage points, about 4.6 percentage points off of even where they were last year. They lead college football at 47.8 completion rate. So just been an elite defense, and they've done it without Benjamin Morrison since the Stanford game. They've done it without Jordan Patelho since game 3. They've done it without Boubacar Traore since game 5. They didn't have Gabriel Rubio for half of their games so far this season. He comes back, and they lose Jason Onye, who had played really good football. And they're young. Notre Dame right now going into this Florida State game. See, they had Leonard Moore, Christian Gray, Don Schuler, Drake Bowen. So they had 4 true sophomores freshmen or sophomores starting. Plus, they play a ton of Jaden Osbury. They play a ton of Kingston Viliama-Asa. And Bryce Young didn't start, but Bryce Young for the last 2 games has played more snaps than the starting defensive end. At least the last 2 games, I believe, against traditional teams. I don't remember if he did against Navy, but he certainly did against Florida State and Georgia Tech. So and your starting Viper and his backup are redshirt sophomores, and Josh Burnham and Junior Chuelemaka. And then, of course, your defensive tackle who comes off the bench when Howard Cross goes down last week, he's a redshirt sophomore. So just a tremendous job by Al Golden this year, Trevor. Just exceptional.
Rarely ever do you see a team get younger and lose the players that they had through graduation and the draft, transfer portal, et cetera, et cetera. Rarely ever do you see them get younger, lose some of their anchoring pieces due to injury, and get better. And on paper, that's exactly what Notre Dame's defense has done. So, Joe, I couldn't agree with you more. I think this is far and away Al Golden's best job as a defensive coordinator, which leaves room for a lot of excitement for what's going to come down the road for years and years and years, ideally, right? So it's a testament to coaching. It's a testament to recruiting and what it means to really bring in top-level talent to Notre Dame. Because if you would have told me at the start of the season that Notre Dame was going to lose Ben Morrison at one point, be without Gabe Rubio and Josh Burnham for a point in time, lose Jordan Botello, lose Boubacar Traore, Jaden Mickey was going to leave the team, a true freshman would be starting at corner, and you told me all of that, and after all of those things happen, on paper they get better, I would have asked, what are you smoking? You know what I mean? Like, what's going on up there? But that's the reality that we live in, which is really, really exciting. So, Joe, I couldn't agree with you more.
I'm going to have to look this up to see if this has happened in recent history. But do you know that Notre Dame has held 3 of their last 4 opponents to less than 100 yards passing? That's nuts.
I know that now. Goodness gracious.
That's nuts. Now, of course, one of them was an option team, sure. But Stanford's not, and Florida State's not. That's really, really impressive. Really, really impressive. But the first part, the offense is yet to play its best game. I agree with that. I mean, even go back to the 66-point game against Purdue. I mean, you had some easy misses from Riley, some missed reads, some missed opportunities. Anthony Knapp getting launched into his chest when he's about to throw a touchdown pass. And they could have absolutely played better that game. They could have played a lot better against Florida State. They could have played a lot better against Georgia Tech. The Army game, the Navy game, you could look at and say, yeah, they could have played better, but that was a really good performance against Army, like Navy. Like that to me is still probably their best performance of the season. I would argue, especially when you consider the possession time and the lack of possessions in that game. Even with Army turning the ball over, it's still one of those games where you had the ball once in the third quarter, and that's it. So you're not going to run a ton of plays in that particular game, and to go out there and still score over 50 points and have the efficiency they had and those type of things, it's been impressive. I mean, look, first 5 games of the year, the offense was only over 6 yards. Actually, they only went over 7 yards per play once. That was against Purdue. In the last 4 games, they've gone over 7 yards per play 3 of their 4 games. So they're getting there. They're getting there. They're becoming a more efficient team. And Joe's right. They have not played their best game. I don't know that they've necessarily played really close to that at this point in time. Now, they may not play to their full potential. There may just be too many injuries, Trevor. There just may be too much going on for them to be what they could have been. But, boy, I tell you what, man, for all the issues we're talking about in the beginning of the season, you remember at one point in time in the season, Trevor, Notre Dame had played 4 games and had only scored over 30 points once in 4 games. And now you look at this football team and you look at their offense and you're like, does Notre Dame seriously rank 12th in college football in scoring offense? 0.3 behind Ohio State and 0.6 behind Texas? Do they really? And you're like, yeah, they do. They're number 12 scoring offense in college football, and scoring team in college football at 38.3 points per game. When you think about where that was at the beginning of the year, you're like, I would not have. Like, if I'd have told you after the Miami-Ohio game, hey, Trevor, Notre Dame's going to is going to average about 40 points a game this year at the end of the year, you'd be like, okay, Brian, listen, when you hired me, you told me we were not going to be homer site. You said we're going to give honest opinions and we're not going to be pro Notre Dame. We're not going to be homers. And I'd be like, yeah, you're right. You're right. But now look at them. This is kind of where we are. And the offense hasn't quite got as to the level where they're as good as I think they can be. Even with all the injuries, I still don't think they're as good as they they can be.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the thing that leaves room for a lot of excitement, and I talked about this on the postgame show, is maybe this is the Notre Dame offense that we see for the rest of the season. Right. And on one hand, it's like, yeah, but they're kind of leaving a little bit of meat on the bone there. Right. But then on the other hand, you go and you look at the amount of points that they're putting up week in and week out. And it's like, well, I mean, if this is the Notre Dame offense the rest of the season, yeah, there's going to be some frustrating drives in there. And then there's also going to be spurts of who can stop this offense. What defense is out there right now that has proven they can game plan for how many different ways that this offense can hurt you. So I'm interested to see what it's going to look like down the home stretch here. But Notre Dame hasn't played their best game. I don't think they're far off once you factor in the injuries and the lack of experience at some positions. You have some guys in and out of the lineup. So, but again, if Notre Dame's not a game performance is hanging 45 points on another Power 4 team,
right. I mean, they played really sloppy football and beat Georgia Tech 31-13. They played really sloppy. They played some sloppy football a little bit early at Stanford, won 49-7. It's like and this is what kind of hit me last night is like, dude, they haven't peaked yet. They're getting a lot closer to peaking, a lot closer, but they're not there quite yet. And this weekend's game is going to be a great chance for them to get there when we see them play Virginia. Another one from Joe Papiti. Thank you, Joe. Here's something. I can't even think how ND lost to Northern Illinois. This is a totally different team. The coaches also seem totally driven. I think I hope that Notre Dame never forgets that Northern Illinois game. I think the media, Trevor, is obsessing on it way too much. Like way too much. Like I saw some nonsense from Andrea Adelson at ESPN that kind of pissed me off. And I don't often get pissed off at ESPN because I just assume they're going to write stupid things. But she's justifying dropping Notre Dame down to 11 in their power rankings from last week. Beat Florida State 52-3. And the whole thing, she talked about the Northern Illinois game. Riley Leonard threw 2 interceptions, and he only has 9 touchdown passes. And I'm like, are we here again? We're just going to pretend like rushing touchdowns, of which he has 13, don't count. Like that's really where we are again. And why are we still talking about a game that happened 2 months ago? You know what I mean? Like if that's all you're doing and you're not recognizing what this Notre Dame football team has been the last 2 months since that game, then you've got an agenda and you're ignoring your own computer rankings because their own computer rankings have Notre Dame much higher than that. The FPI, I believe, has Notre Dame. I'm going to pull it up here real quick, Trevor, but I think the FPI has Notre Dame 4th or 5th. I'm going to pull it up here real fast. Let me go to the FPI. Football Power Index has Notre Dame as the number 4 team in the country, behind Alabama, Texas, and Ohio State. Right? I mean, so I don't know what else you expect Notre Dame to do. I mean, what's the S&P Plus? I'm curious. SP Plus, whatever that guy's stuff is. I'm gonna go. Here we go. Hit SP Plus, which is usually very anti Notre Dame because they don't play SEC teams. They have them 7th, ahead of Penn State, ahead of Tennessee, ahead of Miami, ahead of Indiana. And it's always filled with it's Big Ten, SEC, Big Ten, SEC, 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 Notre Dame, Big Ten, SEC, and then an ACC team at 10. Right? And by the way, he still has Ohio State ahead of like the SP Plus one year had Clemson and Ohio State at the end of the year ahead of LSU. That year happened to be 2019. So after the postseason, Trevor, LSU was not the number 1 ranked team, even though so even that thing, which is a huge homer, it's not homer. That's not the right word. The algorithm is clearly slanted heavily towards the SEC and the Big Ten. Even in that, Notre Dame is 7th. And yet in the ESPN power ratings, which are human produced because it's not any kind of algorithm or anything like that, they continue to fall and drop to 11. Even the AP and coaches have Notre Dame realized that Notre Dame is really good. So those are kind of the things that I look at, Trev, and say that this team is getting viewed incorrectly. We'll see how the committee views it tonight, but that's all fine. But when it comes to Notre Dame, that's the one group that I do want to still continue to focus on Northern Illinois game, because I want them to have that chip on their shoulder. I don't want them to lose that we need to show up and play at a certain standard mentality. Like, I don't want them to have a we've arrived moment. I want them to stay hungry. And I hope that continues all season. I really do.
Yeah, one thing that I've really appreciated from Marcus Freeman is he's talked a lot about preparing mentally and physically. And he got asked on Monday, why have you had so much success in the second half? And all of his answers all allude back to we've seen what it's like when we're not able to handle success. He said that, going up and continuing to run their offense and having a lot of success in second half blowouts of teams is a byproduct of learning from the mistake of not handling success well. You see college football teams blow major league leads every single week, right? And so some of that is just a byproduct of not being able to handle success well. Around mental and physical preparation, he talks ad nauseum around, we've seen what it's like. We know what it feels like to not. You know what I mean? So that I can appreciate. Internally, I want Notre Dame to always have Northern Illinois at the maybe not the forefront of their mind, but always there, right? Always there is that constant reminder that, hey, if you don't prepare like a champion, if you don't practice like a champion, if you don't come in with that mindset, then a team can beat you. One thing that I think that's funny is the Northern Illinois loss is weighing heavier on Notre Dame now than it was in the Purdue week, because now all of these other top teams are losing, and there has to be some justification that there can't be any rational thought around Notre Dame as becoming a better team. It has to be something. You just watch Georgia lose again in very convincing fashion in a game where they look terrible. I don't care who you are. You lose by 18 points. There's no close, there's no miss, you got dominated, right? All of these teams continue. Miami loses, they're the ACC's crown jewel, and they have
a team that Notre Dame beat by 18 points, by the way. I just want to make sure that we remind people of that.
Oh yeah, but hey, Miami would have beat Northern Illinois, Brian, so it's not like it matters. Like, all things break even.
Maybe.
I know.
Maybe.
I know. And that's the argument that's always going to be around Notre Dame until they go and win their first playoff game. And even then, I'm sure there's still going to be some people around. Oh, you remember what happened on September 7th, though? We remember. We know what happened. So, look, at the end of the day, that conversation is going to be what it is. There's just national media people that need to have that one thing about Notre Dame that they feel better about saying, because there's some people out there that just can't accept when Notre Dame's a good football team. We've said it here all the time. What speaks more about a team? One loss early in the season, or what you've done 7 games in a row? I'm willing to err more on the side of 7 games in a row, as I'm sure most of you are. But the Northern Illinois storyline, it's getting exhausted at this point.
There was something that I was having it was a good discussion. I'll call it a discussion, not a debate, with somebody on I think it was on Twitter. And he's a former coach, and he said when he's evaluating teams, he always takes out their best performance and their worst performance and find the median. And I said, I don't agree with that. I think you need to view those things, because you need to make sure that you don't do the things that lead to you playing like you did in your worst performance. And you need to always be striving for repeating what your best performance was. And so that's kind of the way I look at it. I think his argument was more from a sort of like a statistical type of evaluation, But the thing that a lot of people do that, and if you take his point out and you say, okay, let's evaluate his point of view. If you take away Notre Dame's best performance against Purdue, which a lot of people say, well, yeah, it's inflated by Purdue, and you take away the Northern Illinois game away from Notre Dame's season production, and that's when you realize, like, this team is really freaking good. Like that's the thing that kind of frustrates me a little bit, Trevor, is that people aren't willing to do that. I mean, if you take away those 2 games, Notre Dame's averaging 37.9 points per game. If you take those two games away and you look at Notre Dame's numbers, their defense is giving up 11 points per game. The numbers they have now, that's who they are, because they have that one really huge blowout game, and then they have that one really bad game. And if you take those 2 things away, their numbers are identical. This is who they are. They've reached that. Like, that's why I say don't necessarily take those 2 things away, because those things are included. But even if you do, you'll see what this football team is. Okay, so outside of their best day and their worst day, Notre Dame has beaten Texas A&M, a ranked team, on the road by 10. They've beaten Miami of Ohio in a sloppy game by 25. They beat a ranked Louisville team by a touchdown in a game they led for over 52 minutes. They beat Stanford by 42. They beat Georgia Tech on a neutral field in Atlanta, in Georgia Tech's hometown, by 18 in a game where Georgia Tech scored last in the last minute to even make it that. They went and played Navy on a neutral field, beat them by 37 in the game. They were ranked in the top 25, and then just beat Florida State by 49. So this is a really good football team. And that kind of leads into, to the what's at stake for Notre Dame in this game against Virginia, Trevor. And it's that right there. It's build, keep building. That's really key number one when you talk about what's at stake for this Notre Dame team against Virginia. It's you have developed into a dominant football team. And that was the point of the article I wrote yesterday, Trevor, was Notre Dame isn't just like, and dominance isn't like I said this last night, I believe, Trevor, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on it. A friend of mine asked me, I had said, this is the most dominant Notre Dame team I've seen in a long time. And my point was, I think they've arrived as a dominant team. Now, dominant team doesn't mean you're a championship team, right? I'll reiterate that again. Championship and dominance are two different things. Dominance leads to then eventually getting to being a championship team, but you don't have to be a championship team to be a dominant team. And so like all those years, Florida State was a top 5 team and never won a title. They were still dominant. They just couldn't get over that hump of winning a title. Then they finally did, and the results were still kind of the same. They were just able to kind of take that next step. But when I look at it, Trevor, this is a dominant team, meaning they don't have to play they've played their B- C+ games and throttled people. We talked about this at the time. We all, during the post-game show, I believe, was it the Georgia Tech game, or did Vince and I talk about it upon further review? But I believe you guys all said, I could be wrong, well, how would you grade this performance? And I gave it a C+ against Georgia Tech. And they beat them by 18 points on the road in a game that wasn't really close from the second quarter on. Or at least it was somewhat close, but it was never a game you thought they were going to lose. And like that, we've seen what kind of team they are. They're a 6-4 team with losses to Notre Dame, losses to Louisville, losses to SMU. That's and a loss to a 6-2 Syracuse team, right? And so you realize, like, boy, that's a pretty good football team right there. That's a really good football team. I'm sorry, they didn't lose to SMU. They lost to Virginia Tech. But like that's when you've arrived, when you don't have to play your A game. I mean, we saw in 2021, Notre Dame goes 11-1, but when they'd play their C+ B- game, they barely beat a bad Florida State team. They needed overtime to do that. They barely beat a 7-6 MAC team in Toledo, and Notre Dame wasn't that team earlier in the year, but they are now. And that's an impressive thing. But now you got to build on it, Trevor. That's the first thing that's at stake is you no steps back. What I love about what Notre Dame has done is, for the most part, they've been on a upward trajectory for 2 months. You can't have any steps back now. And so now it's about, okay, take that next step, build on it. You've got another good quality football team, better than the team you played last week. Now go out there and put together another strong, dominant performance and build on what you've done as you get into this final 2-game stretch, which is going to define your season.
Yeah, I mean, Notre Dame has been dominant enough. Like, look, at the end of the day, we're fans, right? Like, we will break down the show, or we'll break down the team, we'll break down the games, and provide in-depth analysis. But also, Brian, at the end of the day, we're both fans. We still want Notre Dame to win. We still watch the games with a little bit of that fan mentality of like, this is still my team. I still want them to win. And where I've noticed the shift in Notre Dame this year in them making that transition to becoming a dominant team is I'm watching these games with, I mean, not for a lack of sounding cocky here, but I watch these games and I've never been scared that they're going to lose them. Like I'm sitting back and I'm watching these and yeah, things aren't going the right way, but it hasn't felt like it's felt in the past of like, oh gosh, like this didn't go our way. The mistakes are going to start compounding. The team's going to give up. If they win, it's going to be 19-12. I mean, it's just, now I'm not saying that Notre Dame has played perfect, but they have played in a way where at the end of the day, it just ends up not being a close game. Even their close games don't feel like they're close games. That's a good mark of a dominant team, like the Louisville game. Yeah, it was 31-24, the final score. It felt like it was not that close, So yeah. I agree. Notre Dame needs to continue on this uptick, and we're watching a team improve right before our eyes. I said it in the postgame show that, at the beginning of the season, if Riley Leonard wasn't going to have a good game, that didn't result in 285 total yards of offense, 3 touchdowns, no turnovers. That's not what that was.
Well, they weren't scoring 50 points against anybody early in the season if Riley Leonard didn't play well. And he didn't play well against Florida State. I think he would probably tell you that. He made some plays, but he didn't play well. A lot of missed reads, inaccurate throws. He didn't play well, and they hung 52 on that team. And that's got to be good for Riley. Like, that's got to be comfort. Part of me wonders if that Florida State game was like, did you watch him in the interview after the game? So I don't watch the broadcast. I went, you know that. And I was put it on last night, and I was just kind of having it on his background. I wasn't listening to it. And it was at the end of the game. And I looked over, and he's being interviewed by, I think it was Catherine Tappan, and he looked giddy. And then I turned the sound up, and I'm like, this kid's like giddy right now. And I wonder if this game was an aha moment for him, which is, dude, I didn't play very well at all. And we just destroyed a team that I know how good this team is because we faced this team last year in Tallahassee. And that, hey, I don't have to carry this team like I have, like I thought I did, and like I had to do at Duke. I wonder if that kind of maybe is that final thing he needs to just like, dude, just calm down and play ball. Just relax and play ball. Trust your dudes. You're throwing tunnel screens to Jaden Greathouse, and he's turning them into 20-yard gains. Like, you're going to be fine. You don't need to carry this team. And that's kind of what we've seen. And I wonder if because that leads into the second thing that there is at stake in this matchup, Trevor, which is Notre Dame needs to take another step offensively. And that's the part of the team that where you can see the biggest jump. Like, for the defense, Trevor, it's just keep doing what you're doing. I mean, if you keep doing what you're doing, you can play with anybody. I have no doubt about that. You can play with anybody. Just keep doing what you're doing. Stay healthy. Keep doing what you're doing. The offense is to one that says, hey, you still can and need to get better. And we saw that against Florida State. They big played Florida State. They out-talented Florida State. They had a lot of missed opportunities. And the two videos, I'm going to do just a quick run game breakdown, breaking down the touchdown run and a couple of the big runs and just a couple of things they did. It wasn't a real creative run game and some of the mistakes. But the pass game video, I'm going to focus on some of the missed opportunities that they had in that game. And not in a, gosh, Riley, you got it. But it's just like, look, this is just things where you got to get better because those are correctable things. And you're going to be like, wow, like, could you imagine what this offense would have looked like if he would have made a couple of those throws that we've seen him make in the last month? And that's the thing. And it's like, man, boy, this offense, if you can become more efficient, like consistently more efficient, this offense is going to go nuts in these final three games, Trevor. Like, absolutely nuts in these final three games because the big playability's always been there. But they were sub 50% in run game efficiency against Florida State. That's not good. You want to be around 60. They were over 70 against Navy. Sub 50 is not a good performance, especially against a team that's not very good. You got to get better there. Riley was sub 50, just over 50% throwing the football. For much of the game, he was like he's like 9 of 20 at one point in time. He had a couple, screens late that he hit and a couple balls late that he hit to get him over 50%, but he was off target. He was off target all game. He wasn't making great decisions. That created some of that inefficiency. And then when he did make some good throws, you had drops. You had a drop by Jeremiah Love. You had a drop by Jordan Faison. You had one of his incompletions was the play to Mitchell Evans that I still think was a catch, but he put the ball where it needed to be. So even with all that, he still played better than 51.2, 51.4%. He still played better than that. But you got to hit that quick post route to Jaden Greathouse that would have gone for a touchdown. You got to take that third down read in the red zone that probably leads to a touchdown. You got to make those throws. And that's the next step for this offense, Trevor. And that's what Virginia presents you an opportunity is you've got to start becoming more efficient. This is a defense that requires you to be efficient to really get rolling against them. You can get some big plays against Virginia. But when teams get into trouble, Louisville got into trouble with this, Pitt got into trouble in this, is when if you're not efficient, they can do some things to get you off the field. And that's where this if Notre Dame's going to keep building, and Army's the same exact way. I talked about how good the Notre Dame defense is and where they rank in a lot of different categories. And if you look at it, Trevor, Army's right next to him. Notre Dame ranks number 3 in scoring defense. You know who's number 1? It's Army. Notre Dame ranks number 7 in total defense. You know who ranks number 6 right ahead of them? Army. Now, again, Notre Dame's played a lot better competition, but guys, this is a quality defense. And so you're going to have to really be on be at your best these next couple weeks to play, not to win, but to play to the level that you're capable of to make the statement you need to make. Like, makes me think of this, Trevor. Somebody said something today, and it was about Notre Dame being a Joe Moore Award semifinalist. And somebody said, are we judging this offensive line too harshly? I said, no, we're not. They haven't played nearly as good as they need to play, even before the extra injuries came into play. I mean, you're only missing one starting offensive lineman against Northern Illinois. And I said, but what's going on is the standard has changed. That's the difference. Marcus Freeman has changed. Brian Kelly changed the standard at Notre Dame, not in a good way. Yes, they won more, but he kept tamping down expectations to say, hey, 11-1 against a crap schedule is good enough. 10-2 against a crap schedule is good enough. Hey, look how great I am. Give me a pay raise. We won X number of games. And I'm like, yeah, how many of those teams were ranked? Very few, because your schedule was trash. And the standard was, okay, when a position group was weak, it could get you beat. The 2021 O-line, part of the reason Notre Dame played in a lot of close games is because how awful that offensive line was. You look at other years where the secondary was a major problem to where you're just like, you can't beat anybody good with that. The thing now is the issue with the offensive line isn't that they suck. They've had some moments where they struggled in the middle of the season, but it's more of they're being held to a different standard than what we held groups under Brian Kelly, because now they're not championship worthy right now. It's not that they suck. It's that they're not where they need to be, which is playing at championship football. That's the standard now. The receiving corps does not suck at all. It's better than a lot of receiving corps that Notre Dame's had in recent years, but it's not championship caliber yet right now. And that's the new standard, and that's what Marcus Freeman has changed. And that ties into the point you made, Trevor, which is that standard means that you're not going into games being like, gee, I think they might get upset. And you always have to be concerned about them getting upset. We're not saying they can't get upset. We're not saying that at all. We're talking about our emotional feeling going into a game where it used to be just dread. Like any game was like, gee, you know what I mean? They might do this, they might do that. It's more so, I just don't worry about it the way that I used to. It's certainly possible. We don't acknowledge that it's not possible. Notre Dame's not going to win their next 150 games without losing a game. They're going to lose games. But it's a different feeling now. And that's the standard where you talk about like the offensive line. Number one, I think part of this is built on numbers. They're a top 12 rushing team. They're a top 12 scoring team. They're a top 10 team in the country, and they're going to get some praise. The offensive line is going to get some praise for that. Ohio State's offensive line was also in there. I don't think they're very good. But that's the point, though, Trev, is Notre Dame's offensive line isn't like, I worry about them getting beat by Army because the offensive line is terrible. I worry about them losing to Virginia because the offensive – no, I don't know if they can beat, Texas because of that line. I don't know if they can beat Ohio State because of that line. That's the difference between what was and what is, and that's what shows that the standard is different, Trevor. But that also shows where Notre Dame has continued areas for needed growth over these final three games. That starts with Virginia.
Well, I think that's what's so exciting about this next stage of evaluation for Notre Dame. You and I have talked about it. I've talked about it a lot, that you can kind of break down Notre Dame's season in a vacuum into different stages of evaluation, right? Week one was an evaluation of how do you go into week one, a toxic environment that is just, it's one of the most crazy environments in all of college football against a ranked SEC team, and they passed that test, right? Then week two, it's how are you going to handle that success? And for all intents and purposes, they failed that test. So from Purdue until their bye week, it was, okay, what are you going to do to respond? And then during their first bye week, that 3-game stretch of Stanford, Georgia Tech, and Navy, it was okay. We've seen what we need to see. Notre Dame is starting to come back and putting that Northern Illinois loss further in the rearview mirror. So in this first set of bye week games, can they make the improvements that we thought that they could? And they have. They've passed that test now too. So now we've come in a really exciting point in the season where we're looking at these last 4 games past the previous test against Florida State coming out of their second bye, not by flying colors. The offense was sloppy, right? But they sloppily put up 45 points. So not passing by flying colors by any means, but now looking at this 4-game stretch, 10,000-foot view, big picture, is now it's time to start preparing yourself for the college football playoffs, which is a really exciting conversation to be in, because after the Northern Illinois game, we were not talking about the playoffs. We weren't talking about what does Notre Dame have to do to beat Texas? What does Notre Dame have to do to beat Georgia? What does Notre Dame have to do to beat Oregon? We were talking about what Notre Dame has to do to beat Purdue, right? So the transition from where Notre Dame was after September 7th to where they are now on November 12th is really, really, really exciting. So, yeah, Notre Dame has the opportunity on offense to go out there and clean some things up. But I think the name of the game for them is consistency, because they've also shown spurts where they can be an efficient offense. They've shown it in different quarters, different drives. But like I've said before, Notre Dame has to get rid of, once they get to the playoffs, that spurt of, hey, they have a really good first quarter and then they're kind of absent second quarter, midway through the third, and then they turn it back on again. Or they start slow in the first quarter and then they ramp it back up, second quarter and then, through the third. So I'm going to be looking for Notre Dame's offense to put together a complete game offensively, as far as being efficient, staying consistent, winning the easy, whatever, the layups, whatever you want to call it. That's what I'm going to be with.
I'll be honest. I'm okay if we only get a B-plus game the next 2 weeks if they save their we've arrived moment for Los Angeles. If they just give me a B game the next 2 weeks and just show some growth and they don't have that A game until LA, I can live with that. I can live with that. But in all seriousness, we do need to see that development, that growth statement. Because at the end of the day, Trevor, what's at stake for this game? I was winning, losing, all that. But this is another opportunity for you to make a statement, right? Like, why is Indiana ranked ahead of you right now? Well, because they don't have any losses, and that's fair. I mean, I personally would rank Notre Dame ahead of Indiana, but I'm not going to beef about Indiana being ahead of Notre Dame because, no, Indiana has not played a tough schedule, but you know what? They've certainly played teams that are better than Northern Illinois, and they beat those teams. Notre Dame didn't, right? They played Florida International, who's not a very good football team, not as good as Northern Illinois, but they're not that far off, and they beat them, 31-7. They played Charlotte, who is again not as good as Northern Illinois, but they're in the same kind of ballpark, and they smacked them, right? And they've won the games. They've done what they needed to do, whereas Notre Dame hasn't. But the reason that Indiana gets so much love is because they're not just beating teams, but they're destroying teams. And the more that Notre Dame can continue to do that, the more that people are going to have. The more people are going to have sort of, you can't continue to hold on to that game. If Notre Dame dominates Virginia this weekend and beats Army convincingly next weekend, you're going to get to the point where and handles business against USC, and I'll have some data about how infrequently Notre Dame convincingly wins out in LA as we get closer to that game. But you got to continue doing what you're doing, which is convincingly beating people and giving teams worse losses. And against Virginia, that's going to be a challenge because they do have a couple bad losses, Trev. I mean, they do. We can't ignore that. They have a couple games where, they just flat out got worked. And can Notre Dame beat them more convincingly than what North Carolina did a couple weeks ago when they beat them 41-14? That's going to be tough, and they've got a 14-point loss, a 4-point loss, a 17-point loss to Clemson in a game that was a lot like the Georgia Tech game, Trev, where it wasn't as close as the final score showed. Virginia, I think, scored like 21 points in the fourth quarter. So you're going to have some of those comp games where you kind of, hold them up next to each other. And then, of course, North Carolina beat them 41-14 at their place. So those are going to be the things where, okay, this is another opportunity for you to go make a statement. And if you struggle at home, against a team that would then drop to 5-5, and no one nationally respects Virginia. I think Tony Elliott's, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. I think he's done a heck of a job with this team this year, to be completely honest with you. But it's not a game that's going to move the needle because of who you beat. So it's going to have to move the needle because of how you beat them. And that's essentially where Notre Dame is, and they're going to need another game like that, to be honest with you, Trevor. And based on trends, Notre Dame is certainly capable of, as I mentioned, in their last 7 games, they have handed every single team they've beaten their worst loss of the season to date. Now, the only asterisk is with Louisville, it's tied. with SMU and Miami because they all beat them by a touchdown. But if you actually break the game down, Notre Dame is the only team that never trailed or was never tied with Louisville in the fourth quarter. Those other two teams were Notre Dame led convincingly the entire second half. And as soon as Louisville made it a one-score game, Notre Dame went right down the field and made it a two-score game again. You know what I mean? So it's really about making that statement, Trevor, and giving the committee that final statement of, hey, guys, I know we lost now almost 3 months ago because when the rankings come out, it'll have been 3 months since Notre Dame lost Northern Illinois. We're destroying people. That's who we are now. And that's what you need to base this off of. But they're waiting on you to fall back, right? Like that's the thing. They're waiting on you to have that 24-21 game against Virginia where they can say, see, that's who Notre Dame is. That's why we have them ranked where we have them. And unfortunately, it's kind of asking a lot of a team to just destroy people every week, but that's essentially what Notre Dame has to do, Trevor. And then the final piece, too, that we'll talk about, Trevor, is Notre Dame at one point in time until going into last season going into last year's Louisville game had a 30-game regular season win streak over the ACC. They lost that game and then lost another ACC game two ACC games later to Clemson. I want to see Notre Dame reestablish dominance in the ACC. And they have done a pretty good job of that, to be honest with you, here recently. Obviously, after losing to Notre Dame last season, or losing to Clemson last season, which was their second ACC loss in 3 games, they went out in their next ACC game and absolutely annihilated Wake Forest 45-7. Come into this season, I do not count Stanford last year as an ACC game because they weren't in the ACC yet. They beat Louisville by a touchdown, so you beat a ranked ACC team. You beat Stanford by 42, beat a good Georgia Tech team on a neutral field. It was an away game that they chose to play on the neutral field by 18, and then, of course, you just beat Florida State by 49. So not only winning against the ACC, but a lot of those wins during that 30-game stretch were not competitive. And they need to get back to that and go out there and absolutely smash Virginia to make a statement to the rest of college football to say, hey, guys, this isn't just a hot streak. This is who we are. And this is why you need to respect us when it comes to the rankings. And this is why, as long as they keep handling business, Notre Dame needs to be playing at home that third weekend of December.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that gives me, a lot of confidence that Notre Dame can continue blowing out opponents the way that they have is they're not doing anything crazy. When's the last time you saw Riley Leonard take a snap deep in the fourth quarter? They're not keeping their starters on the field for the duration of all of these games to get to beating their opponents by 30. They're just running their offense. And then the second team comes in and just runs the offense. It's funny. I mean, out of their last 4 games, the game where they did pull out all the stops and run the fake punt and run a fake field goal, they scored the least amount of points in that game. All the other games, they were just running their offense. So, yeah, I agree. It is a tall ask, but I don't think that not you specifically, but nobody's asking Notre Dame to do anything that is even remotely close to beyond the realm of capabilities for them. It's literally just go out and play to your standard, which is, again, it goes back to that dominance conversation that you and I were talking about at the beginning of the show. And yeah, I mean, reestablishing dominance in the ACC is going to be imperative for Notre Dame. I mean, that 30-game win streak that they went on prior to the loss to Louisville last year was impressive. For all the people that say Notre Dame should go join a conference, okay, why? I mean, they are affiliated with a conference and are working them, so they don't have to. But besides the point, as long as Notre Dame continues to take care of business, I think everything else will just continue to fall into place.
So that's going to end segment 1 of our show today, Trevor. We're going to move on to a breakdown of Virginia next, folks. But do me a favor, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. Y'all know the drill. Hit the notification bell, share this podcast, give us a 5-star review. And, of course, as always, make sure that you are signed up for our message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. So, Trevor, let's talk about Notre Dame's next opponent, the Virginia Cavaliers, because from you and I's discussion before the show, we're kind of on the same page about this Virginia team. But let's give a little bit of a quick rundown of who the Cavaliers are. Virginia is 5-4 on the season and started the season off relatively well, Trevor. They were a surprising 4-1 football team. Had wins over a 34-13 win over Richmond. They went on the road, beat Wake Forest by a point. Lost to Maryland at home. That was probably the worst loss they've had all year, in that you lost to that team, a game they should have won. Then they went on the road and blew out Coastal Carolina, beat Boston College at home by 10 in a comeback game, by the way. I believe BC had an early lead in that game. Had a really hard-fought loss to Louisville. Louisville jumped up on them 17-7. Virginia rallied back, took a 20-17 lead, made a big fourth-quarter stop that you thought was going to be kind of the end of the game. Couldn't make enough stop, or couldn't do enough on offense to really milk the game out. Louisville goes down and scores in the final couple minutes of the game to win that one 24-20. So very, very good win in that regard for Louisville, who was really struggling at the time, Trevor. I mean, they were coming off of back-to-back losses over Notre Dame and SMU, and were reeling a little bit and needed that win to kind of somewhat right the ship a little bit. And it's turned out to be huge because they lost a week later to Miami. But now, instead of being losers of 3 and 4, which they were, now they're winners of 3 and 4. And of course, that Virginia game was part of that. So hard-fought loss for Virginia. Next couple games, Trev, not so hard-fought. They got blown out by Clemson, 48-31. And as you and I pointed out, it was not that close of a game. It really wasn't. It was a blowout. I mean, I think Virginia scored 21 points in the fourth quarter. It was 38-10 at the end of it was actually, I should say, it was a competitive game in the first half. Virginia actually had a 10-3 second half lead. Clemson scored the last 2 touchdowns of the half to go up 17-10. And then third quarter is when Clemson just steamrolled them and put 3 touchdown drives together, Virginia, to make it 38-10. So it went from 17-10 at the end of at halftime to 38-10 going into the fourth quarter. Virginia scored. Clemson came down and made it 41-17. Virginia scored to make it 41-25. Clemson scored to make it 48-25, and then Virginia scored to make it 48-31. It really wasn't a close game in the second half. And then the North Carolina game was the one game that they were truly just dominated for 4 quarters. They were down 24-6 at halftime against North Carolina. The Tar Heels had 2 touchdowns in the third quarter, including a pick 6. And then Virginia scored early in the fourth quarter. Clemson and then North Carolina kicked the field goal, and that was the final scoring to win 41-14. And it looked like Virginia was reeling. It really did. They had a bye week, and Tony Elliott did a great job getting his team back on track during that bye. I mean, they were reeling. They looked bad in losses to North Carolina and Pitt, Trev. Clemson, they looked bad. They come out of the break, and they go to Pitt. They go on the road, and they beat a top 25 Pitt team. And a game where they had to come back. Pitt actually had a lead. I think Pitt was up 13-7 early in the game. And then Virginia rallied back and ultimately won that game. I think they took a lead. I'm about to pull up the box. I thought they took a lead from Washington. They took a lead, and then Pitt took it back, and then Virginia won. Let me just pull up the box score here real quick. Yes. No, Pitt made it closer. So Pitt was up 13-7 at halftime. Virginia scored twice, including with help from Pitt, because Pitt just really struggled. Scored 2 touchdowns in the third quarter. Pitt scored to make it 21-19, went for 2, didn't get it, and then Virginia put it away with 2 minutes left, kicking the field goal for the final outcome by 24-19. So much needed win. So instead of 4-5 and losers of 3 straight, they're now 5-4 and coming off of a road upset over a ranked team. I'm sure no one was happier about that than Marcus Freeman, because he's like, well, this is going to make it a lot easier to sell that this week, because you know what I mean? I'll say this just big picture, Trevor, and I'll kick it to you. This is not a super talented football team. We're not going to try to convince you that it is. But the one thing Ryan and I commented a lot last year was Virginia was not good, but they played hard for Tony Elliott. This year, they are the same exact way. They're just more talented than they were last year in certain spots. But this is a team that is coached relatively well. They're sound. They don't beat themselves a whole lot, but they play real. They're a physical team that doesn't quit. I mean, even the North Carolina game, I'm watching the second half, and they're just getting their butts kicked, but they're not quitting. They're battling. And you got to give Tony Elliott a lot of credit. He had that team was on the verge of just becoming a joke in the ACC. And he has really done a good job of kind of, finishing well last year, not with wins and stuff, because they were not a very good team last year, but just being competitive, Trevor. That's really the big thing. I mean, they had a couple blowouts late, but they only lost to Miami by 3 last year on the road. They only lost to a ranked Louisville team by a touchdown. They upset Duke late in the year. They beat North Carolina on the road. They only lost to BC by 3. They only lost to NC State by 3. They lost to James Madison by a point. Like, they competed, they battled. And then coming in this year, they've been able to kind of turn the corner a little bit. And now they have 3 tough games at Notre Dame, home against SMU, at Virginia Tech to end the season. They just got to win one of them to be in a bowl game. That's not going to be easy. But this is a team that, outside of a couple players, and we'll get into the specifics of the players, it's not a super talented team, but this is a physical team that is going to make you work. And they're a relatively disciplined and well-coached football team that Notre Dame is going to have to be prepared for. And you got to give credit to Tony Elliott for getting this team to where they are after how things started in his tenure.
Yeah, you and I were talking before the show about Virginia's issue is just the talent gap when they go up against that next tier of college football teams. They remind me a lot of Stanford in that, there's a big athletic gap, but they're going to play you hard for 4 quarters. And teams like that are able to pull off upsets, right? We saw it last week because they feast on other teams' mistakes, which, if you want to know why Brian and I were talking so heavily on offensive efficiency, and you want to talk about why Notre Dame needs to build a full 4-quarter game and using that Navy game as a benchmark of how they need to perform, it's teams like Virginia that are why. Now, I do firmly believe that Notre Dame does not have to play their A game to beat Virginia. It's not one of those, right? But what did we talk about? We talked about perspective and the scope of how people look at Notre Dame. And if they don't come prepared, ready to play, this could be a 28-17 type of game. This could be a 31-20 type game. It's just a game that is so much closer than what it needs to be if Notre Dame doesn't come ready, prepared to play a gritty football team. I think that's a really good word to describe Virginia. They're not going to do anything athletically outside of a couple of positions that are going to blow you away, right? There's not really a whole lot of people on offense where you look at them and say, yo, like, this guy could blow this thing open if Notre Dame doesn't. No, it's nothing like that. But if you don't come ready to play your standard of football, Virginia's a team that's just going to hang around, man. They do a really good job at hanging around because they're very physical, they're disciplined, and they love to play for their head coach, who, after back-to-back seasons of 3-win seasons, he's having his best season by far and is already at 5 games with 3 games left to play. So I like Tony Elliott. I like what he's done to turn around Virginia a little bit, and hopefully he can keep building there. Just not at the sacrifice of doing it to Notre Dame. So, yeah, but this Virginia team will play you tough for 4 quarters. They will.
So let's talk about the Virginia offense, Trevor. Obviously, this side of the ball they have a couple decent players. We'll kind of go over just some of the overall production here as we kind of break this team down. But when you look at what excuse me, what they are on this side of the ball, it really comes down to you have to make sure that they have to work for everything they get. That's really the big thing. You have to make them work for everything that they get because they're not a very dynamic team. They're not a real good big play offense. You look at the numbers. You put these up in an article you have out today, Notre Dame opponent preview. Trevor, offensively, they rank 81st in the country in scoring at 26 points per game. They're 60th in yards, 72nd in yards per play, 86th in rushing yards, 91st in yards per rush. They are 39th in passing yards. They've trailed a lot, but they're 52nd in yards per attempt, only 72nd in yards per completion. They rank 102nd in sacks and tackles for loss allowed and 127th in sacks allowed, partly because of you and I were going through the numbers. The last 3 games, they've given up 20 sacks in the last 3 games alone. You look at some of their other numbers, Trevor, third down offense, they rank 109th. Their red zone offense, they rank 98th in the country in red zone offense. There's just nothing really endearing about this team when you look at their production on offense. There's some players that I like, and we'll get into those here in a second. But they're just honestly, they're not a very good team. And you put in your breakdown, you put their overall red zone offense, which is 98th. But it's actually even worse than that, Trevor, because they're 132nd in red zone touchdown offense. So even ranking as low as you had them, and you put in the correct number. I'm not saying your numbers were incorrect. I'm saying it's worse than even the number that I have, because I told you you're putting in what I told you to put it. Like so I'm not blaming you for that. I'm saying when you look even further beyond just the overall red zone numbers, you realize that a lot of their scores are field goals because they can't put the ball in the end zone. And so on paper, it's a really rough matchup against a Notre Dame team that's one of the best defenses in the country. But the Irish defense is going to have to be on top of its game, because they let a Florida State offense that's even worse kind of move the ball down the field a couple times early in the first half last week. So they're going to have to be on top of their game. But just big picture, this is not a great offense, even though there's a couple guys that concern us, and we'll talk about those here in a second. But they're going to need either a lot of Notre Dame turnovers, or they're just going to have to play their best game of the season to really be able to score enough on this Notre Dame team to pull off the upset. And that side of the ball is really the big reason why I don't worry about losing this game. It's more so about, you just don't want them to have a sloppy win that people can look at and say, see, 5-5, Virginia team, and you guys, now Indiana beats a 5-4 Michigan team and they move up 4 spots in the AP poll. But if Notre Dame beats a 5-5 Virginia team, they're going to fall down. Or if it's a close game, that's just the reality of it. So this side of the ball is the one where you've got to make sure they don't play beyond where they are and make this game a lot closer.
Yeah, I agree. Virginia just doesn't have the horses on offense to compete. Like, unfortunately, they have a couple of guys that are pretty decent. They do. And I know we're going to dive into those in a second. A lot of their issues lie up front on the offensive line. They do not do a good job of protecting the quarterback. Like you had touched on, they've given up 31 sacks in 9 games, which ranks at the bottom of college football. I think that puts them at 127th in the country. So, and again, rushing, they don't do a great job at opening up rushing lanes. I don't remember which game it is, but I think I saw that Virginia in one of their games as a team had 7 yards rushing. So it's just their offensive line kind of handicaps them a little bit. Quarterback play hasn't been great. Their starting quarterback has 12 passing touchdowns and 8 interceptions. So he's one of those guys that when he does get pressured, and it's quite often, he will turn the ball over. But Virginia is just a team that, like we said before, they're just good enough to hang around because they're gritty. They'll play you hard for 4 quarters, which is why Notre Dame has to be extremely efficient with what they do on defense. Florida State had no business starting that game going on a 16-play, 75-yard drive. Just didn't. So, spoiler alert, a key victory of mine on Thursday is start fast for both the offense and the defense, because you could make the argument that the offense has done a better job in this 4-game stretch of starting fast. I mean, better than the defense has. So it can't be one of those things where you allow a team like Virginia to walk into South Bend, a place where you've already been upset this year, and kind of get that mentality of, we could kind of do this. We can kind of hang with these guys. Because you saw that a little bit on Saturday with Florida State. You saw that a little bit after Florida State went on that offensive drive. Their defense was like, can we hang around? And then quickly, Notre Dame shut the door on that relatively quickly. But you just don't want a team like that to – I mean, we talked all last week about how Florida State kind of gets hit in the mouth a little bit and they kind of quit. I don't see that out of this Virginia team. I don't. So you just don't want it to be closer than what it is, because – again, it's all about the scope. IU can go on a 10-game win streak of not playing a single team that has 6 wins yet, and they can beat a 5-4 Michigan team by 5 points, and it's fantastic because the mindset is, they're IU. And Notre Dame could do the same thing, and they will drop them in the rankings. There's no doubt in my mind about it.
So, Trev, offensively, they don't do anything that's overly earth-shattering. They're a spread team. Honestly, they don't look a whole lot different than what Tony Elliott likes to do, right? I mean, Clemson, when he was the OC for those really good Clemson teams, it's a spread offense. They'll spread the ball around relatively well, run a lot of inside zone, mix up their runs. They'll run a lot of read zone. Matter of fact, that's one of the biggest things I'm concerned about in this game is Michael Calandria being able to make some, or Anthony, Calandria, being able to make some plays with his legs. And that was really their offense in the first 2 quarters against Louisville. It's just him pulling on the backside of read zone and just taking it out the back gate. I mean, that's where they got a lot of their big chunk runs in the first half. He's a kid that can scramble a little bit. You know, when you look at the production this season from them offensively, Trev, and you have this in your breakdown, Kobe Pace is their lead back. He's got 442 yards in the season, 4.4 yards per carry. He's got 32 more carries than Xavier Brown, who has 436 yards, 6.4 per carry. He's the guy that actually concerns me on their offense from a running back standpoint. He's only got 8 fewer yards than Pace, but he's got 32 fewer carries than Pace. And he had actually he sparked that off. He gave the offense that big play they needed to kind of get back in that Louisville game on that little wheel route he had out of the backfield, catches it wide open, beats a blitz. It was a really nice call. And then he made a guy miss in space and then housed it. You know, that was a big play for them in that game. And he's the guy he's got some shiftiness to him. Trevor, you were talking about this with me when we were on the phone. He's got some shiftiness to him, and he's actually got speed where Kobe Pace is more of like a bigger kind of a physical back. You know, for them, Kobe Pace is 5'10", 215. I believe that Brown was injured last year. I don't think he played a lot last year. Yeah, he didn't play at all last season. So I believe he was injured last year. But he's a big play weapon for them. That concerns you a little bit. Calandria out of the back. I mean, think about this, Trev. Anthony Calandria has 259 rushing yards in the season, which doesn't like strike a lot of fear in your heart, right? I mean, it's like, oh, 259 yards, that's it. Well, what are you guys talking about? You're worried about him. All right, guys, they've given up 30 sacks for 193 minus yards. A lot of those were because of on Anthony Calandria. You take away the sack yards, this kid's over 400 rushing yards. Again, he's not Riley Leonard, he's not Jalen Milroe, but he can hurt you. He can be a chain mover, and that's the thing you've got to avoid. And at times this season, we saw it a little bit with Florida State, a couple times early in the game. We saw it with Connor Wegman in the opener, where a couple times they kind of let him tuck it up and move the chains with his legs. He can do that, and that's what you got to hope to avoid. The pass game weapon that I really like, Trevor, it's just that they haven't been able to really get the production out of him that he's capable of. If he played in a different offense, there'd be a lot more conversation about Malachi Fields, in my opinion. Not a burner, but he's 6'4", 220, physical pass catcher, good hands, solid route runner. He's a very good football player. Leads their team in receiving yards this year, Trev, with 45 catches. The next closest is 27. He's got 665 yards. The next closest is 325. And he's got 4 of their 15 touchdown receptions on the season. And he's had some big moments. He went for over 100 against Louisville, 9 for 129. He had 11 for 148 against Wake Forest. Last season, he had 58 catches for 811 yards and 5 touchdowns. So this is a kid that's got some ability. He's got some potential, Trevor. And what's crazy about his numbers last year, 58 for 811, he didn't have a single game of 90 yards or more last season and still put up those kind of numbers. This year in 9 games, he actually has 3 100-yard games, 45 catches for 665 yards. He's the one guy you say, and with his size and strength going against, Notre Dame's got good length at corner, but they're young. You worry about, like, could they hit a couple back shoulder throws and some things like that? That's the concern with that matchup. But he's really the guy you look at and say, to me, it's Anthony Calandria's running ability. It's and some of his playmaking ability. It's Xavier Brown ripping off a big run, and it's Malachi Fields kind of playing at his A game. That's the 3 guys that you really look at that you have to be focused on, not concerned about, but focused on if you're the Notre Dame defense. Don't let those 3 guys beat you. And I'm also very curious if they have any kind of Chris Tyree type of packages this week. He's been banged up all year. He hasn't been a big part of their offense. He was back returning kicks and playing a little bit against Pitt. I think he had 4 catches against Pitt. You have to think they're going to try to do something. But personnel-wise, those are really the 3 guys that you look at and say, you've got to make sure those 3 guys don't take this game over. Because like a gimmick here, a gimmick there, and we'll talk about that here in a sec, Trev, that'll happen. But losing a game comes down to you can't stop Ontario Brown. Right? I mean, that's what it came down to. It's not a play here, a play there. It's like he had a lot of plays. And that's what you can't allow Xavier Brown, Anthony Calandria, or Malachi Fields to do to you.
Malachi Fields is a solid receiver, man. He's a guy he's not going to burn you for a 75-yard touchdown. He's not that guy, but what makes him so dangerous in the offense, he has really strong hands. He's not afraid to catch over the middle of the field. He's really good on the sideline. And he's that receiver that can kind of eat you up for those 15 to 20-yard chunks at a time, right? And when I go through and I look, I mean, Notre Dame's corners, for good reason, have been like relatively untested the last 4 games. Like they haven't really had anybody that can test them that way. I mean, I know around Stanford, we talked a little bit about Alike Omener, but he really just didn't get the opportunity to go up and make many plays because the pass rush was so good. Ideally, that is kind of the same storyline, but I do believe that there will be a couple times throughout this game where the Notre Dame corners will be tested a little bit with Malachi Field's size. I think that's going to be interesting. And Notre Dame's corners are still relatively inexperienced as well. I mean, Leonard Moore is going on his, what will this be for him? His 4th start. He started the Louisville game and then started Georgia Tech, Navy, and Florida State. So Leonard Moore is going on his 4th start. Christian Gray is going on his like 8th or 9th, going back to did he start it all last year?
Christian Gray?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Okay. No, because he didn't start the bowl game either. But he played starter snaps against Pitt because Jaden Mickey started the game opposite Cam Hart when Benjamin Morrison was out. But then Cam went down like first half, and Christian stepped in and basically played starter snaps. And he played starter snaps against Oregon State, but I believe it was still Morrison and Mickey in the starting lineup.
Okay. Those were the 2 games that I couldn't remember if Christian Gray got the start or just came in and took the share of the snaps due to injury. So, excuse me. So, yeah, I mean, I'm going to be interested to see how they go against Malachi Fields because he is a senior and he has a lot of playing experience. So that's going to be an interesting matchup to watch. But again, you just can't let Xavier Brown rip you up for big chunks in the run game.
Yep.
Just can't. I know the scoreboard might not show it, because Notre Dame won 52-3, but Florida State's running backs were getting chunks at a time. I think, their backup running back, Singleton, he averaged close to 6-7 yards a carry in that game, and Toafili went for a good amount. So it just can't be one of those games where they get into a rhythm.
You hit on something there, Trevor. That's the concern in this matchup for Notre Dame, because we just listed off all those statistics that you had in your breakdown, right? I mean, 81st in scoring, 60th in offense, 86th in rushing yards, 39th in passing yards, 109th in third down offense, 98th in red zone offense. But here's the thing. They rank 36th in most plays of 40 yards or more. They've got more than Notre Dame does. You have 11 plays this season of 40 yards or more, which again is a good number. They rank 36 in most plays They rank 30. No, that's Virginia Tech. Sorry. They rank 53rd in most plays of 50 yards or more. Again, both numbers higher than all the other key statistics. The reason they rank so low in points and yards is because of the negatives. Well, Notre Dame hasn't been a great team at generating negatives, tackles for loss and sacks, although they're coming off of a game where they certainly did a lot of that. But they've been a pretty good big play offense. And I just talked about how it was that big play. They had a couple big plays against Louisville that really sparked their offense in that game. And that's what kind of got them there, because they're not a team that's going to consistently move the ball up and down the field, Trevor. And this is why what you were talking about is so important, is you can't allow them to chunk you to death, right? You can't. I mean, it just comes down to that, Trevor. You can't allow them to rip off 5-6 big plays. They either get them in a scoring position or even worse, result in touchdowns. You just can't do it, because when they start getting some of those big plays going, that's when they can make things a little bit more interesting. And as I said, we saw that against Louisville. They had a 46-yard touchdown from Xavier Brown, and Malachi Fields had a 28-yard gain. Cameron Courtney had a 27-yard gain. He had some chunk runs from Calandry. He had 3 or 4 runs of over 10 yards in that game, 84 yards on 15 carries in that game, because Louisville wasn't able to get pressure on him. And that's the thing. Louisville, I think, had 2 sacks in that game. That's it. They weren't able to get to him a whole lot. And so that allowed them to move the ball. And that's what Notre Dame can't allow them to do, Trevor. They can't allow them to have those big plays. If they do that, then this is a game that honestly they should dominate, because all that. We just described a 7-on-7 game, Trevor. It's an 11-on-11 game. And the reason that Virginia's offense struggles is because their offensive line is just not very good. It isn't. I mean, it just – I've tried to think of ways to kind of, hey, you know what, like they do that, but they're not. Here's the thing. They're tough kids. That's what you say about them. They compete. They play hard. They get after it. They're decent run blockers at times. But overall, Trevor, this is just not a very good offensive line. And they do have some size, I guess you could say that. They do have some size. They're 328, 318, 313, 300, 293. So they have some decent size at some spots. They do have some size at receiver with Malachi Fields. Their tight ends, decent size, 6'4", 248. But they're not very good. And they really struggle with any kind of quickness and athleticism. And that's certainly what Notre Dame is going to be throwing at them. And somebody just asked, whose O-line is better, Florida State or Virginia's? I'd probably say Florida State's. Virginia's plays harder. Florida State's is more talented. Is that fair? A fair comparison between the two?
Absolutely fair. Yeah. I mean, Florida State, and I know we're talking about Notre Dame's 8-sack performance against them, but Florida State's offensive line, when they want to, is definitely better than Virginia. I mean, from a talent perspective. Now, there is a factor of, well, are you that good of an offensive line if you don't try? I hear that. But from a pure talent and athletic perspective, it's Florida State's offensive line. Virginia's offensive line just kind of speaks for the rest of the team. They're gritty. They'll try hard for 4 quarters. But, they're just not, decent size, I guess. I mean, their right guard is 6'3", 293. So their size is fine. They just, when they go up against longer, more athletic, fast, quick defensive lines, they get eaten alive.
The one area that I'm a little concerned about, Trevor, to be honest with you, is at nose. Donovan Heinisch has to build on what he did last week, because the one guy on their offensive line that I look at, I'm like, that's a pretty decent player, is their center, Brian Stevens. And if you look at kind of his performances, it's not a shocker that their worst performance of the season, in which they gave up 10 sacks, was a game that he didn't play. He didn't play against North Carolina. It's not a shock, because he really sets the entire – I mean, he's a really smart kid, very experienced kid, kind of sets the tone, kind of gets everybody where they need to get to. He's a good football. He's a quality guy. He reminds me a lot of Zeke Correll when Zeke's healthy. You know what I mean? And Zeke's having a great year at NC State, by the way. If anybody hasn't paid attention, Zeke's having a heck of a year at NC State. But, where he's not the biggest, not the most athletic, decent, because Zeke was never the athlete he was in high school because of all the injuries he had at Notre Dame. So he had to put some weight on. This is a scrappy kid, smart kid, battles. And then, of course, the game that they don't have him at center, they're just terrible. That's not it's not a coincidence, Trevor, that was the case. He's just, that's kind of who they are. And he's the glue for that offensive line. I mean, here's what they've done in every game he's played in rushing wise: 273, 123, 384, 121, 148, 68, 170. Right? Not great, solid. The game he didn't play against North Carolina, whose defense is, let's be honest, not good. Run defense is okay. 7 yards. 7 yards. So, right, you know what I mean? He's back now. This is now his second game back. Their offensive line, they still gave up some pressures to Pitt, right? Because their offensive line's not good and Pitt's aggressive. But they looked better, certainly, than they did the week before against North Carolina. And a big part of that's Brian Stevens. But the rest around him is just not very good, if I'm just being honest. But you nailed it, Trip. This is a very blue-collar team, and they are the epitome of that. Them and their defensive ends. Those two groups, how they play is how this entire team plays. Just not the most talented, but they battle their butts off, and that is really the culture that Tony Elliott's building. If he can recruit better players, they might actually be okay, because these kids are coached relatively well, and they play hard for him, Trevor. They do. They play hard for that guy. There's clearly a respect there with their head coach, in my opinion. I don't see how you keep playing as hard as they do when there's really not a lot to play for if you don't kind of love being part of that team and respect the guys that you're playing for, head coach, coordinators, position coaches, and all that. And you have to give Tony Elliott a lot of credit for that.
Yeah, I mean, Virginia is just filled with they're a team filled with guys with a bunch of high motors. They are, and that's their offensive line in a nutshell. I actually wrote about the matchup of Donovan Heinisch going up against the interior of the offensive line for Virginia because it is an interesting matchup. I mean, we got a glimpse of what it was going to look like with Donovan Heinisch getting starter snaps against Florida State, but you know, throughout the season up until
And
Florida
boy,
State,
did he good.
sure did. Sure did. I mean, he was their highest graded defensive lineman, ripped off 2 sacks. Like
Yeah.
leaves a lot of room for promise. But I am going to be interested to see what it's like now that like he is the guy. Like he's not the rotational guy that comes in. I think he's going to handle it very
Right.
well. I do. But it's interesting now that he's
Right.
going up against Stevens. Yeah.
And you're going to need Rubio to play a little bit more probably in this game. To be honest with you, does Mookum play a little bit more? Do you get some more beef in there with those guys? That's the interesting thing about it. But like with Florida State, like once they're going to start eating them a little bit, that offensive line part of the reason Notre Dame had 8 sacks is because I think that offensive line just kind of gave up, third quarter and just kind of Virginia's offensive line will not, I don't care if you're up 31-0 at halftime. They're going to come out second half and they're going to battle you like it's nothing. That's just the way this team is. And that's the difference is you're going to have to earn, like where Florida State is like you just kind of out-talented them and then they kind of quit and that team just has no heart. I mean, they just don't. This Virginia team is going to battle you for 60 minutes. It doesn't matter what the score is. You're going to have to earn everything you get against them. And you should be able to get something against them because they're just not good. I mean, that's the thing, Trevor. I'm not going to try to spin it to y'all and try to convince y'all that, boy, they're a couple plays away from being 9-1 and ranked in the top. I'm not going to say that. I mean, they look. Yeah, they should have beat Maryland. That's the one game you look at and you're like, God, how did you lose that game? But look, Louisville's better than they are. Clemson's better than they are. North Carolina's better than they are. Maybe not 41-14 better than they are, but they're better than they are. And their other wins are over BC, which is a great win. Pitt's a great win for them. Wake Forest on the road, it's a good win for them. And you just look at it, Trevor, and you're like, hey, listen, this is a team that's going to battle you. They're just not talented. But if you just kind of come in the hey, we're just going to roll the balls out and just they're going to lay down and die. Not this team. Maybe the one you played last week, but this team is not going to roll over and die. It's really not. And your defense is going to have to be on top of this game. And if it is, they should dominate. Let's be honest about that. If the defense plays like they have the vast majority of the season, if not all season, really, this is a game that you should – the point should be really low for this offense, if we're being honest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a team that has more wins on the road than they do at home. They have a belief in their head coach that, no matter what the score is, they're going to go out and play hard. And there are times where that benefits them. I mean, look at the Pittsburgh game. And if anybody watched that game, that was a really ugly game. But it was Pitt's motor and it was their consistent play. They go out every series like the scoreboard is 0-0 and their mindset is, let's win this rep. Like, let's win this series, this play. And I think that mindset shift is what's helped them go from a 3-9 team and now they're staring down the barrel at 5-4 and trying to become bowl eligible. So, they're a team that's going to play hard and it's going to be a relentless motor. It's not going to be like last week where you hit them in the mouth a couple times and they're going to lay down. I think that's a good point, Brian. I think that's why Florida State allowed 8 sacks. But this Virginia team is one of those where, if you get the best of them and you get a sack in the backfield, they're not just going to say, oh, well, here we go. This is going to be the rest of the game. They're going to try to get theirs. So it's a team that you have to come ready and prepared to play for sure.
That's going to do it for the offensive breakdown, Trevor. We're going to go to the defense next. But before we do, folks, y'all know the drill. See you right there behind you. Hit that or underneath us. Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, share this podcast. Definitely do that. Helps us out, guys. I know a lot of people are talking about they're not getting notifications for the show. This is one of the things you guys can do is to make sure that you're doing that. So we get thousands of views on each show, and we only get hundreds of likes. So if you're listening and watching, hit that like for us. We'd greatly appreciate it. So let's dive into the Virginia defense, Trevor, because in a lot of ways, their defense mirrors their offense. In a lot of ways. The difference is there is, at least on that side of the ball, there is at least one stud on that side of the ball, which we'll get into. But, the defensive story, as I said, very similar to the offense. You look at the rankings, 82nd nationally in scoring defense, 98th in total defense, 49th in rushing yards, 87th in yards per play, 46th in yards per rush, So decent run defense, which fits really well with what we're going to talk about. 118th in pass defense, 98th in yards allowed per attempt, 112th in yards allowed per completion, 76th in passer rating, 127th in sacks. They have allowed on the season this year, they've allowed 15. They have only registered 15 sacks on the season, which is not a good number. So they just don't get a lot of pressure on the quarterback. When you look at them too, Trev, 65th and third down offense, and they are 114th in red zone offense. Now, if you're looking at it for Virginia on the season, they've turned the ball over 12 times in 9 games, which is not good, but they've only forced 11 turnovers on the season. So they're not a team that so far this season has been overly effective at forcing turnovers. But what was one of the things that helped them beat Pitt? It was the first time since the Boston College game that they forced more than one turnover. All right, so 2 turnovers, win over Coastal Carolina. 3 forced turnovers, win over BC. 1 against Louisville, loss. 1 against Clemson, loss. 0 against North Carolina, loss. 2 against Pitt, win. Right? So they're going to try to force turnovers. They're just not great at it. And honestly, some of the turnovers against Pitt were more about Pitt than they were, at least one of the interceptions was more about Pitt than it was about Virginia. And, even in that game, like Eli Holstein has just a seam route wide open and he just throws it into the ground. And it's not a great offense, Trevor. It's not a great defense from an effectiveness standpoint. We talked about their red zone. Their red zone defense, I should say, is not very good. They rank 114th in college football in red zone defense. But here's the one thing that I'll say. Their defense is the polar opposite. Well, actually, it's the same exact as their offense, meaning red zone trips result in a lot of field goals. That's true for their offense, but it's also true for their defense, Trevor, because even though they rank 114th in red zone offense, they rank on the season, they rank 37th in red zone touchdown offense, which is, you don't often see a team rank in the bottom 20 in red zone overall and then rank in the top 40 in red zone touchdown rate. What it means is they're not forcing red zone turnovers. They're not making red zone stops, but they are doing a good job of holding teams to field goals. And so that is the one thing you look at and say, that's something to keep an eye on for Notre Dame. When you get in the red zone, can you turn them into touchdowns instead of field goals? And that's allowed them to keep staying some games at times, Trevor, is the ability to keep teams from getting in the end zone. So that's a big part of that defense. And then the other part too, Trevor, is they're very susceptible to big plays. They've given up 8 plays of 40 yards or more on the season, which isn't terrible, but they give up a lot of 30 plus. They rank 117th in college football in plays allowed of 30 yards or more. They rank 51st in plays of 40 yards or more. They rank 34th in plays of 50 yards or more. So they don't give up a lot of like the 60, 70-yard home runs, but they give up a lot of 20 pluses and a lot of 30 pluses. Now against Notre Dame and the athletes that Notre Dame has at running back and quarterback, 35-yarders against Virginia from other teams are going to be 60-yard touchdowns because of Notre Dame's talent. But they are a team that you can chunk to death. And that's what Notre Dame is going to have to do. So that's overall. They're a 4-2-5 team, Trevor. They're a hybrid 4-2-5. They have a position they call the spur. It's a lot like how Mike Elko had his 4-2-5 personnel at Wake back in the day, and even at Notre Dame, where their spur, which is technically their 5th DB, is 6'4", 221. He's a bigger, long, rangier kid, can do some linebacker stuff. They line up in a lot of over-under type stuff. They'll occasionally kind of pinch down in some bear looks, which I actually wouldn't be shocked if we see that a little bit against Notre Dame in Notre Dame's 12 personnel sets, to be honest with you. But they're a basic team with that. They don't do anything exotic. They'll bring some second-level pressures. They'll bring some third-level pressures. Jonas Sanker is going to come flying down a lot against the run. We'll talk about personnel a lot here in a little bit, Trev. But there's nothing exotic that you really look at and say, hey, Like their offense is going to run reverse passes. They're going to run, flea flickers. They're going to do a lot of stuff to try to create big plays. Their defense is kind of like, hey, we're going to line up, we're going to play hard, and we're going to come at you and get after it. They try to mix up coverages at times, but honestly, they're just not good at it. That's why they blow a lot of coverages when they try to do all that disguising stuff, which is why I think partly why they kind of play basic a lot in this game. So schematically, nothing that Notre Dame hasn't seen before. Alignment-wise, nothing that Notre Dame hasn't seen before. And then personnel-wise, this is actually a game that worries me more than it should on paper. And here's why. They're very big up front. Their nose tackle's 311. Their starting D tackle, number 90, is 309. Their two ends are both 260 plus and physical. They're not great pass rushers, but like Cam Butler is physical. Chico Bennett is physical. And neither are explosive. Chico's had some success as a pass rusher in the past. He had 7 sacks 2 years ago. Hasn't had a whole lot since then. Their linebackers are big kids, 235, 240 plus pound kids. Cam Robinson I like him as their Mike. Number 7, James Jackson's a solid player, not as good as the other kid, but they have a very long rangy, second and third level. Cam Sanker or Jonas Sanker, 6'1", 6'2", close to 6'2". I mentioned the Spurs 6'4". They have a corner that's 6'2", another safety that's 6 foot. They play a lot of another. Caleb Hardy plays a lot at safety. He's 6'3". So they're pretty long, rangy defense. They're just not real fast. But I worry about their size and physicality giving Notre Dame's offensive line problems. That is probably one of the biggest matchup concerns to where maybe you don't play as well against them as you should because they're big and physical. That is the one concern I have about this game. If the offensive line plays well, this will be a blowout. If the offensive line gets pushed around and Notre Dame can't run the football, then this game may be a little bit closer for at least a while than it should be. And you even said it to me, Trev. I mean, their defensive line is not real talented athletically, but they compete. They're big and they compete.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the same as their offensive line, right? I mean, we're talking about the comparisons between offense and defense. They just have a relentless motor, man. I mean, they're 2 defensive tackles. They carry a lot of weight. They're big kids, but they don't move really well. But I'm with you. It is their defensive ends. Their defensive ends are on the more athletic side of their defense, but they play really, really hard. So I'm going to be interested to see how Anthony Knapp holds up against guys that are like against the bull rush from a guy who's, their weak side defensive end has shown multiple times that he will just try to run you over, bull rush you back and kind of forklift you back into the quarterback, which has been an issue that Anthony Knapp has had this year. Yeah, linebackers, they have good size, which is going to be interesting to see how they play in the run. They're very much a downhill defense, but out in space that there's room for Notre Dame to expose them out in space, but you touched on him already. Jonas Sanker's a dude. That is a good football player, man. He is Virginia's starting safety and leads the team in tackles and tackles for a loss. Yeah. So leading your team in tackles for a loss as a safety is pretty impressive. So, and that's not just sacks, right? Like that's not they send him on a lot of, safety fire blitzes and he's getting after the quarterback as a free rusher. I mean, he's just blowing up plays in the backfield because he plays downhill really aggressively and he has good size. So, yeah, I am worried about how Notre Dame's offensive line is going to play because last week they didn't get that good of a push against Florida State's offensive or defensive line. There's been games
also big.
Yep.
Right. Mm-hmm. Now you said it to me, Trev, and you're spot on. I'll bring it up here. The thing is, the difference is they're at least athletic. Virginia's is not. But we've seen big defensive linemen give this offensive line problems at times in the season. We have. And that can't be ignored. You talked about Sanker real quick, though, Trev. He is a guy that is a second and first level defender. He's not. He'll do some coverage, but it'll most likely be at times against, out cuts and crossers and stuff like that. He'll take the tight end at times. He's not a guy that's going to be playing a lot of man coverage. He's not going to be playing the center field. He's got, I think, 2 interceptions in the last 3 years. He is a force. He is a downhill force. That is kind of what they do. He's a really good all-around player. I think he can do those other things. I actually do. I've watched some film of him, Trevor, and I think that he's a guy that can cover, especially tight ends, if you need him to. But he's not a guy that they ask to do that a whole lot. And he's been more vulnerable to getting beat in the pass game this year, in my opinion, than he was last year. He's given up a completions at a higher rate than he did last year, but he's a guy that you really need to have a plan for, trying to limit his ability to disrupt you. Like you said, what's he got, 6 or 7 tackles for loss on the season? Is it 6 or is it 7? 7? It's a safety with 7 tackles for loss in 9 games. I mean, he's on pace for almost double-digit tackles for loss. And a guy that makes a ton of tackles. And it's not just like, tackles where we talked, who was it, Miami of Ohio? Or who was it that we talked about earlier in the year? But we started talking about like Old Dominion, remember? It was the Miami of Ohio game. And I was making a point about how their linebacker makes a ton of plays, but he's not, and he has tons of tackles, but it's not like the Old Dominion team where like they had 2 guys that ranked among the national leaders in tackles, but like they both had like twice as many assisted tackles as they have solo tackles. And that's not really the case. That hasn't been the case the last 2 years of Sanker. He's got 69 tackles during the season, Trevor. 47 of them are solo tackles. The next closest guy has 30. So he's a really good in-space guy. And that's part of what I like about him in coverage is he'll give up completions, but he arrives right when the ball does. And you're not making a lot of plays after the catch on him. So for context, Notre Dame's leader in solo tackles this year's Jack Kaiser with 30. Now, part of that is Notre Dame's defensive players haven't played as many snaps as Virginia starting defensive players, because we talk a lot about Riley Leonard, but there's been a lot of games where Xavier Watts is not playing a whole lot in the fourth quarter or late in the third quarter either, especially the fourth quarter. So that factors into it a little bit. But the point is, that's still an impressive number. 47 solo stops for a safety that's not he's not an in the box safety. You know what I mean? He's not their rover, which is their spur. He's not that. He's a safety. Just says a lot about how good this kid is. And the other thing, too, that I wanted to point out, you made a comment about the 2 ends, Cam Butler and Chico Bennett. The other thing to keep in mind is they're both in that matchup against Anthony Knapp and Emil Wagner, who are still young guys from Notre Dame. They're both 6th-year seniors that transferred into Virginia. So these are creeping up on to being close to their mid-20. I mean, they're 23, 24-year-old guys, at least 22, but probably 6-year players. I mean, if they're 6-year guys and they were 18 when they enrolled, that means they're 24. You know what I mean? Going against a kid in Anthony Knapp who's 18, 19 years old. There's just going to be times that grown man strength is going to get to him. You just need to make sure that as best you can, if you are having problems, you need to have a plan for how to help Anthony out a little bit with how you game plan, sliding your protections, things like that. But and they do a lot of really physical twists as well. Not a lot. They'll do some, and you have to be prepared for that as well. So I'll put it like this, Trevor. You should be able to score and score a lot, but you're going to have to earn it against Virginia. Physically earn it against Virginia. Because overall, we talked about Jonas Sanker, but outside of him, it's not a super talented football team. It really isn't. They have a couple guys I like. Like I said, I like Cam Robinson. I think Chico Bennett's a little bit more athletic than Cam Butler. Cam Butler's a little bit more powerful than Chico Bennett is. Like I said, the Cam Butler kid, you talk about a relentless motor. I mean, that guy he's number 82. That guy has a relentless motor. I mean, he plays hard, and you got to be prepared for that. And speaking specifically about Notre Dame, that's a concern because they're just not real big. I mean, both of their offensive tackles are 290 some pounds. So that's a matchup that I do get a little bit concerned with, Trevor. It's just the physicality and the experience and power that those kids bring to the table. Could they do some things to kind of stuff Notre Dame's run game a little bit and make life a little bit harder maybe than we think it should be coming into the game?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way that I can sum up Virginia as a whole Is there a team filled with a bunch of guys where you kind of look at the team and you say, I want that guy on my team? You know, like he's experienced, he's the senior, he's the 5th or 6th year guy. He might not be the most talented person in the room, but he's going to give you 110% of everything that he has. And Tony Elliott has a full roster full of those guys, you know, with a couple of, you know, special talents sprinkled in there, and, you know, Malachi Fields and Xavier Brown and Jonas Sanker. But yeah, those are kind of the teams that you kind of have to look out for. And I'm not here to paint this picture that if Notre Dame doesn't bring their A+ game, that Virginia is going to beat them. I do not believe that. I don't think anybody in the chat does. Brian, I know you don't believe that. But this is a team that it is going to have to be you do have to earn your keep a little bit physically. And it's almost kind of a polar opposite of the game that you had just played under the lights in your home stadium 2 days ago. You know, this isn't a team that's going to come in and, you know, get punched in the mouth and like, all right, well, here we go again. This is a team coming off of an upset win over a top 25 team in their house. You know, they're riding that level of confidence of like, yo, we can compete with some of these teams. You know, some of these players have to be sitting there thinking, yo, I just watched this Notre Dame team at home in a 3:30 kickoff game lose to Northern Illinois. I think we're better than Illinois. Yeah, so there's going to be a lot of things that Notre Dame's going to have to battle through early, and they're going to have to show up ready to play physically. And if they do, I think they're going to be fine.
Here's another aspect of this, Trevor, is this is another team late in the year that has a pass defense that struggles. Their cornerbacks especially, I think, are guys that you can absolutely go after. Can Notre Dame find ways to get after them? Can they find ways to attack Jonas Sanker with the pass game in a way that prevents him from being a force against the run? Can they find ways to go at and beat Jam Jackson, who looks a lot like the Thomas kid from Florida State, physically 6'2", long, not as good. Doesn't run as well, just not as good. He's the guy that teams have really been able to exploit on the season and take advantage of him. Can the pass game really take advantage? That's going to be a big thing. And can you protect the quarterback enough to do that? That's going to be a big key to this game. We'll dive more into that on Thursday. But that's something that I am very much looking forward to. And here's another ingredient. Because this is a physical defense and a physical offense, I think it would benefit Notre Dame. Not that they're not going to try, but like just not saying like this needs to be your plan, but we're just speaking results-wise. If they can really whoop this team and get a big lead and then get guys out in the second half, that'd be great ahead of the Army game next week. Your next 2 games are on the road. You're flying out to the East Coast the week before Thanksgiving. You're flying out to the West Coast the week after Thanksgiving. If you can have back-to-back games where your guys get limited snaps, in Florida State, even though, you know, Riley Mills played over 40 snaps, they weren't super physical snaps. I mean, they were dominant snaps. They weren't like, oh my gosh, that was a grind. I need to take an ice bath after this game. You know, there's some games, Trevor, where you play 30 snaps and you're like, dude, I just was in a battle. And there's games you're in 50 snaps and you're like, dude, I feel great because I just whooped those. I mean, you know what I mean? And that's how this Virginia game is. So it'd be really nice if they could kind of have, especially for the defense, if they could have this real dominant performance, just blow Virginia out so that you can get Riley off the field in the second, Riley Mills off the field in the third and fourth quarter. You know, you can get Xavier Watts out of there in late third quarter, early fourth, and take some of that pounding off, because you're going to need every bit of that next week against Army with that option offense. And then, you know, my fear is back-to-back grueling games, physical games before you got to fly out to LA for Thanksgiving is my concern. So it's all about building to that USC game. If you can handle business, and a lot of this goes on the offense. If the offense can do what it needs to do, they're the ones that are going to determine if the defense can get off the field. You know what I mean? And so that's going to be a big key. Is I do not feel great if they have to play back-to-back really physical games before USC, where Riley Mills is playing 40, 50 snaps, or 45 to 55 snaps. If Xavier Watts is playing 60 to 70 snaps, you know what I mean? Like, I don't love that. Getting ready to go play the triple option, we're going to have to defend a lot of snaps, and then you got to go out and play out in LA the next week. And who's going to have a more mobile quarterback in the game now. Like that's my concern. And that's why I want to see this offense really come out and put this game away, Trevor, because I do not want to have these lines go 60 minutes against the hard-nosed blue-collar kids we talked about. Use your athleticism to put this game away so you don't have to be in that gritty trench warfare type of thing for 60 minutes. That's going to be a big part of this one.
Yeah, I agree. I'm really glad you brought that up because, Army is going to play you, like most of the service schools will, they're going to play you extremely physical, extremely tough because they are well aware of their athletic disadvantages when they play a team like Notre Dame. So the offense is going to be able to help out the defense just as much as the defense is going to be able to help out the defense in this game. So use the athleticism to your advantage, get your fast guys to the perimeter, put this game away early. I don't know necessarily if this is going to be a game where, Riley Leonard doesn't see a snap in the third quarter. I don't know if it's going to be that type of game, but it has the potential to be. Notre Dame absolutely has that capability.
Be nice.
Mm-hmm.
Be nice.
Yep.
I just like they're not like the Purdue game. They do in some ways remind me of Purdue, but they're just a lot better in that they're big and physical, but they're not overly fast. And that's how Purdue was, and this Notre Dame offense just rolled them. But they're better than Purdue defensively. They have more ability top to bottom, where Purdue's top guys were kind of, they were kind of like, they had a couple guys at the top, and then they weren't good at a lot of other places. This team, to me, is just, they're better. They're overall better than Purdue, which is why their numbers are better than Purdue. But they're built similarly, except that they're a 4-down team, which I think allows them to get an extra athlete on the field, where Purdue tried to be a 3-4 team, like a true 3-4 team. And that didn't work out real well against Notre Dame. They were just going to line up in their 3-4 defense, and Notre Dame was like, Virginia's going to have one less big guy on the field. That's what helps them a ton. But to your point, though, Trevor, is Notre Dame is a very athletic team. If this becomes a game about speed and skill, it could get to that point in time. I'm just concerned that Virginia may not try to do a bunch of body blows to try to extend this thing out. That's good. But you're spot on. If this becomes a track meet, Notre Dame will roll Virginia like North Carolina did. Because that's what North Carolina did. They out-athleted Virginia in that game. They just say, hey, we're faster. We're not as big and strong as you are. So let's not pretend that let's not try to be. We're going to out-athlete you. We're going to penetrate you up front on your offensive line. We're going to shoot gaps. We're going to bring pressures. We're going to make your big stiff offensive lineman move and handle twists and stunts, and you're not going to be able to. And offensively, we're going to get you in space. We're going to make your linebackers tackle our guys in space. We're going to make your DBs tackle our guys in space. That's who they are. And Virginia was able to punish them with that. Consider this. Notre Dame on the season has 73 missed tackles. A lot of that was early. Virginia has 95 missed tackles on the season. Notre Dame's leader in missed tackles is Adon Schuler at 7. The most missed tackles they have from a linebacker, 6. Cam Robinson has 14. Jonas Sanker has 8. You know what I mean? So, get them in space. Make them tackle your athletes in space. I would push the tempo in this game a little bit, to be honest with you. Get them on their heels. Don't let them line up and get their calls in and things like that. Make this a speed game, right? And if they do, then they roll them. And as somebody in the chat says, isn't that who Notre Dame is? Exactly. But they don't always play to that. There's been some times this year where Notre Dame's kind of, let's go slower and we're going to run. We saw that against Florida, not against Florida State, but we saw that against Navy. If Notre Dame plays with the same pace and urgency against Virginia that they played against Navy, they will steamroll this team, in my opinion. Steamroll them. I didn't see that same urgency and pace against Florida State. That's where I'm coming from, Trevor. Now, I think part of that was the rust, and it's harder to play with pace when you're throwing a lot of incompletions and you're getting a lot of short and, not positive runs. So that's where the execution kind of comes from. So that's my takeaway, Trevor. I do want to make sure they need to make sure this game is not a 4-quarter battle before they have to go play Army next week. You want to be fresh going into that game. And the way to do that, offense, give us some points. And then for Al Golden, it's like, okay, let's really try to create some turnovers, because that's where they can help the other side of the ball. That's, I mean, Virginia is not a terrible turnover team, Trevor. I mean, they're not a team that's like in the top 10 in lost in turnovers lost. They're 54th in turnovers lost. So, but Notre Dame's a really good turnover team. And, Virginia, if you look at it in their 4 losses, the only game they didn't turn the ball over was against Louisville. They had 2 turnovers against North Carolina and 4 against Maryland. That's what did them in that game. And then they barely beat a Wake Forest team that's not very good. They had 2 turnovers. And so, Notre Dame has been a team that's forced 2 turnovers in all but two of their 9 games. That needs to continue this week. Forced turnovers in this game could get out of hand. Make it about speed, which I think then leads to turnovers, and that's how this game could get out of hand. So that's going to do it for the defensive breakdown, Trevor. We're going to talk a little bit about the college football playoff here next before we get out of here. But before we do, folks, hit that like, hit that subscribe, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, give us a 5-star review. And as always, make sure that you sign up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. So, Trevor, last segment for the show is we're going to talk a little bit about the college football playoff rankings, which are going to be live tonight for those who are listening on this via podcast. That will have already happened because this show is going to go up tomorrow, so this will come up on Wednesday. But for those who are watching this live, we are going to go live tonight at 8:30, and we're going to have a live kind of breakdown of the rankings as they are released. And then, of course, we'll talk about where they're going to be for Notre Dame. But the one thing we know, Trevor, we don't know what the rankings are going to be, but we do know there's going to be a shakeup of the rankings because of how last weekend went. And how will that affect Notre Dame? I mean, we're going to find that out tonight. And I think there should be an impact for Notre Dame, but I'm curious how it's going to be. So last week, obviously, Notre Dame was 10th. You had Oregon 1, Ohio State 2. We expect that to stay the same. They both won. Ohio State won convincingly this weekend, beat Purdue 45-0. Oregon beat Maryland 39-18 in a game that was never really competitive. Oregon was a little sloppy early, I felt, Trevor. They scored. It was 14-3. Maryland scored with 3 minutes left to make it 14-10 in the second quarter, and then Oregon put a touchdown on the board late in the second quarter. They pulled ahead in the third quarter. Maryland made it an 11-point game, and then Oregon ended up getting a field goal and a touchdown. It was a sloppy game, but it's still a 21-point win. They should stay number 1. Ohio State should stay number 2. Georgia was number 3, and Miami was 4. Both went down last week. Georgia not only lost, but lost convincingly. And I am very curious to see how the playoff committee handles Georgia, because if you listen to all the ESPN talking heads, they think Georgia's still going to be ranked really high. And they could, because the committee overrates Georgia, just like Penn State. This is not a very good Georgia team. And I'm very curious to see how they view Georgia after that loss. Do they drop them to 7, drop them to 8, or do they drop them out of the top 10, which they should? Because they not only lost this weekend, Trevor, they got their butt kicked. And the thing we talked about with like Notre Dame is when you evaluate these teams, you evaluate Oregon, you evaluate Ohio State, you evaluate Texas. You have to evaluate them over the course of who they are over an entire season, right? And that's why I've said Oregon should be ranked ahead of Ohio State. But if I'm talking about how a team is playing going into a rematch in the Big Ten title game, I'd much rather be Ohio State than Oregon. That's just how I feel. I think when you look at how their line started to kind of come together in that game against Penn State, and started kind of, hey, they can play physical football up front, and I just like that. But they're both, you evaluate them over the course of an entire season. You evaluate Texas over the course of an entire season. Georgia, and here's the deal. Georgia has played 1.5 good football games this year. And the half came in the second half of a game when they were down 28-0. Because they did play well against Alabama to come back. They were down 28-0 and took a lead in the fourth quarter. You can't dismiss that, right? I mean, they were down 33-15 going into the fourth quarter, 37 at halftime, and with 2 minutes left, they took a 34-31 lead. Now they gave it right back on literally the very next play. But look, this is a team that has well, let me rephrase that. They've played 2 good games. They played a good half against Clemson, a good half against Alabama, and a good game against Georgia or against Texas. That's it. That's it. And that's what their resume is built off of. They played very poorly against Kentucky and barely beat Kentucky, who's a 3-6 football team, by the way. Let's not forget that Kentucky is a 3-6 football team that has lost 4 straight games, all by 3 of the 4 by double digits, including a 14-point home loss to Auburn, who is not good. Georgia had an ugly win over Auburn this season as well, the week after getting beat by Alabama. It was a very sloppy game for Georgia. They were up 14-3 at halftime, 14-10 late in the third quarter. Auburn had a lot of mistakes that kept them from making that a more competitive game. They were very sloppy in their win over Mississippi State, only won by 10 over a Mississippi. Like, put it to you like this, right? Like, when you look at Mississippi State losing to Georgia by 10, that is Mississippi State's tied for their most competitive loss of the season since the second game of the year when they lost to Arizona State. And that game wasn't as close. Like, Toledo beat them more convincingly. Florida beat them more convincingly. Texas certainly did. Arkansas did. Tennessee did. Mississippi State stinks. They've beat Eastern Kentucky and UMass. And Florida and Georgia was in a dogfight with them. And they gave up well over 300 yards in that game. They were not good in that game, Trevor. And then, of course, they come out and they played very average against Florida. That 14-point win, very, very misleading. They were trailing in the second half, I believe, of that game. They were trailing most of the game, Trevor. They kind of pulled away late. And that was against Florida's third-string quarterback because DJ Lagway, their number 2 quarterback, got hurt very early in the game. So when I look at this Georgia team, if the committee does what they say they do, which is take the whole season into consideration, Georgia should not – I don't think Georgia should be in the top 12, much less the top 10. Yeah, they got a great win over Texas. Okay, so let's put Vanderbilt up high because they have a great win over Alabama. You know, hey, it's let's put some of these. I mean, there's been plenty of teams that have wins over these highly ranked teams that aren't very good. Let's put Arkansas in the top 25 because they have a really good win over what's been a good Tennessee team this season. You have to bank it on your entire season. And when you look at Georgia this year, they are not a good football. They're not a great football team. They're good. They're clearly good, but they're not a great. And you can't say, well, it's because they're 7-2 because their schedule is so hard. No, they're not blowing out the bad teams on their schedule, Trevor. They turn the ball over a ton. Their secondary stinks. This is not a vintage Georgia team. If we're being honest and we're looking at it that way, you can't tell me they are. There's nothing about this Georgia team that blows me away. And I know what the computer rankings on it say, but I watch them play, Trevor. There's nothing about this team that makes me say, boy, this team is really good. Nothing.
I mean, even in Georgia's best game against Texas, they didn't even play well as a team. Their defense played really well.
The defense played great. Yeah.
Trevor Etienne played really well. Carson Beck played like garbage. Like, I'm sorry, he did. He had 0 touchdown passes, 3 interceptions, and a 56% completion percentage. Their leading receiver had 2 catches for 45 yards. So, like, even in, like, Georgia's best game, they only played really well on one side.
They didn't run the ball either, Trevor. They ran for 108 yards.
Like,
they had less than 300 yards of offense in that game against Texas.
And they were also helped out by the fact that for some reason, like, Texas didn't run Jadon Blue. Like, he didn't get 1 touch, like, in rush, but he had 7 receptions. I don't know what that was about. That's just a small little nugget. But again, the point remains the same. In Georgia's most marquee win, yes, you can look at it from macro view. It's like, well, I mean, they beat Texas by 15 at Texas. And it's like, yeah, well, how did that look?
They blew out Clemson. Can't deny that. Right.
Yeah. They blew out Clemson, which on a neutral field, which, I mean, it wasn't a 31-point
in a game that was 6-0 at halftime.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, you could also look at it and say, Louisville's win at Clemson looked just as convincing. In my opinion, it did.
Because Louisville outplayed them for 4 quarters, where Georgia outplayed Clemson for 2.
Yeah. And Cade Klubnik played not even arguably his worst game, probably in a Clemson uniform.
Of the season for sure. For sure, of the season.
So it's just, you go back and share, like, you can pick apart any team's wins. Like, I understand that. But Georgia is not this dominant team. Like, this isn't 2021 Georgia.
Georgia played against Kentucky the way that Ohio State played against Penn State. Right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, hard fought, grind it out, win late on the road. Okay, Ohio State does that over Penn State, and I think Penn State's overrated, but my thing is Penn State's a top 12 team. I just don't think they should be top 5 or 6. But they're a top 12 team, in my opinion. With that defense and the running backs they have, they're a top 12 team with the way their schedule's played. They're just not a top 6 team. But, like, that's – you expect to kind of grind out those wins. Notre Dame only getting a 7-point win over a good Louisville team. That's what they're doing against Mississippi State and Kentucky, who are combined, I think, 5-13. You know, but like it's like, but I got to hear about look, Northern Illinois is better than Mississippi State. They are. I've seen what Mississippi State does against a MAC team. They got destroyed by a decent MAC team this year because Toledo's not dominating the MAC. Their most dominant win of the year was against an SEC team on the road. You know what I mean? So I am very curious to see because I still think they're going to rank them high, Georgia high. Then the other question is, what do they do with Miami? Now, ultimately, Miami falling behind Notre Dame, which I expect to happen, doesn't really impact Notre Dame's eventual placement because even if they fall behind in Notre Dame, let's say they go up to like 7, they would then vault. Like you and I were talking about this. Let's say Notre Dame goes up to 7. Like, all right, going to be at home. Well, not necessarily because if they drop BYU behind them for having an ugly win over Utah, and they drop Miami behind them, those teams the winner of those leagues would still then go ahead of Notre Dame, and they drop them back to 9 when the seeding comes out, because 2 of the top 4 or 3 of the 5 conference champs would then be ranked lower than Notre Dame. So then they would still fall. So if that's going to be the case, then you need to get up to 6 to maintain a home game. They're not going to do that tonight. We'll see if they can do that here in future games, but they're not going to do that. They're not going to have that tonight. So my prediction, Trevor, is that Miami falls below Notre Dame. I think Georgia falls below Notre Dame. I think BYU, Indiana both stay ahead of Notre Dame, and I think Alabama leaps Notre Dame. So I think what you're going to see is Notre Dame is going to – my prediction, and I hope I'm wrong, is that Notre Dame only goes up to 9th. Now, I don't think Bama should be ahead of Notre Dame. This isn't what I think should happen. This is what I think will happen because they went on the road and beat an okay LSU team. Smacked an okay LSU team. So that's what I predict will happen tonight, Trevor, with the top 5. Because, I mean, there's no reason to change Oregon. There's no reason to change Ohio State. You can't flip – even though I think Ohio State's better than Oregon, I don't think you can flip them because Oregon beat them, right? I think Ohio State is in my prediction is going to come out tomorrow. I do my projection of the season. I will actually still have last 2 weeks when I've done my first 2. I have Ohio State as a 1 seed because I know that they're not going to get to number 1 right now, but I have them beating Oregon in a rematch. So I think they're going to be the 1 seed, and Oregon will be the 5. But for now, you leave them there. I think Texas slides up to 3. The question I have is, does Penn State then slide up to 4? Does Tennessee leap them? Like that's going to be somewhat interesting, but doesn't really matter a ton. I think Indiana slides up to 5. And then, Indiana slides up to 6, right? Because Texas goes to 3. No, hold on. Yeah, Penn State goes to 4. Tennessee goes to 5. Indiana to 6. Then the question is, does BYU slide up? Or does Bama jump in there? Does Notre Dame slide up? Like, how do they view – here's the key. How do they view Notre Dame now that Miami got beat by Georgia Tech, a team that Notre Dame gave their worst loss of the season? That's going to be the thing that could say, okay, Penn State or Indiana finally plays a team with a winning record and they barely win. They don't even have a winning record anymore. They did at least when they played. They don't look good, while Notre Dame goes out and just obliterates another team. You know, like what's the game that triggers people for Notre Dame? Was it Florida State? I doubt it. You know, so but you look at it, could that be enough to vault Penn State, BYU? Who, yeah, BYU's undefeated, but the committee clearly doesn't love BYU because even though they have 2 top 25 wins, they're still behind Indiana. But BYU has not played great football recently. They barely beat an Oklahoma State team who needed a miracle kind of last-second comeback, who's 3-7, and they just needed a miraculous officiating, enhanced win over Utah, who's now 4-5, because Utah got screwed in that game, by the way. Absolutely screwed in that game. So that's kind of where I'm at, Trevor, is does Notre Dame just go up one? Do they pass Georgia and Miami and then get leaped by Bama? Or do they bolt Bama and Notre Dame both up at the same time and just keep them where they are? Because Bama was 11. So just move them both up 2. And they could potentially move them both up 3 and also drop BYU down. That'll be interesting because BYU's not playing great football, but hey, they keep winning, right? They keep winning. And you got to give them credit for that. So that's my rant on that, Trevor. I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of how you see it shaking out. What are your questions going into tonight about how things are going to go?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the biggest questions are going to be what the committee decides to do with Georgia and Miami. I have what I believe that they should do, and let me say this loud and clear. I hope that I am wrong in this. I really do. I hope that I'm wrong. I think the committee is going to have a hard time moving Notre Dame past either Georgia or Miami. I do, just for how not because of how they view Notre Dame, but it's because of how they view those two teams. I mean, you and I can sit here and dissect all the live long day about why Notre Dame should be above both, and I will firmly believe that they should. I have no faith that the committee will. I don't. I think there's going to be a lot of shuffling between the top teams, and I think Notre Dame's win over Georgia Tech earlier in the season is going to do enough to keep Notre Dame at 10th. I think what they do is they swap Alabama and BYU, because BYU barely beat a bad Utah team, and Alabama beat an LSU team on the road very convincingly. And I think a lot of the shuffling is going to be at the top. And like I said before, I hope that I'm wrong. I really do. But until the committee shows otherwise, that they don't weigh the Northern Illinois losses heavily, because I think them putting Notre Dame at 10th kind of shows that they do a little bit.
To a degree. I still think if they viewed it too harshly, they would have had it behind Bama. You know what I mean? Like, all the teams ahead of them were either no-loss teams or one-loss teams that had better losses and have quality wins. I mean, sure. Tennessee has good wins. I mean, they beat Bama, right? That, to me, is a better win than beating A&M. You know, so like Georgia beat Clemson and I'm drawing a blank. Who's the other good win? Texas, right? So you could understand Georgia being ahead of them, even though Georgia hasn't played well. I could see Georgia. I will be honest, Trevor. I'd be a little surprised if they have Miami ahead of Notre Dame. I will. And the reason I say that is because the one knock on Miami was they really don't have any great wins outside of Louisville. And now you've played your second best team you've played all year, and they beat you. And kind of, they didn't beat you convincingly, but it wasn't a fluke. That's kind of the way I look at it. You know what I mean? It wasn't a fluke. When you look at the game, Trevor, and this is ironically 2 years in a row, but Georgia Tech led at halftime and then never trailed again the rest of the game. They took a lead with 12 minutes to go in the second quarter and then never trailed, and actually led Miami until 2 minutes to go left in the third quarter by double digits. They scored at the 6:46 mark. And so then they had a 2-point lead. So the fact that they controlled the action against Miami, because I think that's something that hurts Notre Dame too. And the reason like the Ole Miss loss to Kentucky is not viewed as bad as a Northern Illinois loss is because Ole Miss led most of that game. They just lost it at the end, where Notre Dame trailed Northern Illinois for most of that game. They had a 7-0 lead, and then Northern Illinois tied it and then took the lead, and Notre Dame never took the lead back. It was how they lost also has to be factored in. But I don't think the committee loves Miami. If they loved Miami, they would have had Miami ahead of Georgia. If they loved Miami, they probably would have had Miami ahead of Ohio State because they're undefeated. I think the fact that they were behind 2 one-loss teams is why I do think they're going to fall behind. Because it doesn't matter at the end of the day if they fall behind, because if they don't fall behind, it won't matter because the ACC champ's going to leap Notre Dame anyway because they're going to get the bye.
Right.
So It doesn't matter a ton. I'm more concerned about the second team in these leagues and the third team in these leagues being ahead of Notre Dame. That one doesn't matter as much to me. Georgia staying ahead of them would be more problematic for Notre Dame. And this isn't problematic for Notre Dame in regard to making the playoff. They're going to be in. It's more problematic in regard to, do they get a home game? That's more of where it's at for me. So, like, if the ACC and Big 12 are behind Notre Dame, which I think ultimately they will be, you need to be 6 if you're going to get a home game, because you're going to have 2 of those teams leap you when it's all said and done. So how much of a leap can they get to this year, this week? That's going to be a question. And I think, Trevor, if you're correct and Miami and Georgia both stay ahead of Notre Dame, that's going to tell us there's nothing Notre Dame can do the rest of the year to improve their standing with the committee. Nothing. Nothing.
Yeah, and again, that's why I said I hope that I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But I just, based on the way that they voted in the first week, like they are, to me, I think the committee is pushing narratives more than they are looking at the overall record of teams. Like I hear your argument about if they viewed Miami that highly, but like they put Miami at 4th, which I thought was higher than what they should have been anyways, right? Like that's my take on it.
Don't disagree, but the problem is the number 5 and 6 teams on their thing don't have any good ones either. That would have been the problem, just because, like, when you look at Ohio State, you could say, okay, Ohio State doesn't have any, like, they have a better loss than they don't have any loss. Like, Miami doesn't have any losses, so clearly Miami has a quote unquote better loss going into last week than Ohio State, because they haven't lost yet. But Miami's best win was number 22 Louisville by a touchdown, where Ohio State's best win was over the number 6 team in the country at their place. So, like, okay, they got that better win. And so to me, if the fact that Ohio State with a loss was still ahead of Miami, I don't think that they viewed them that way. Whereas, like, with Texas at number 5, what's the big win Texas is building their resume on? They don't have one. Miami literally had a better win than Texas did. Miami had a better win than Penn State did, which is why they were ahead of those 2 teams. You couldn't make that case against Georgia and Ohio State. Now that they also have a loss and still don't have, any good wins outside of that, then I think that's the case. The other thing that I think helps Notre Dame with Miami, and again, I could be wrong, I'm just saying, like, this is what I hope is being discussed in this conversation, is that was a team that Notre Dame played against recently, also with a backup quarterback in the game. Now, I know Haynes King's played some, but he didn't play the full game. And Notre Dame beat them handily. So, like, I think that might factor into it a little bit as well. Why I do think Miami will fall behind. I'm not guaranteeing that. Ultimately, it doesn't matter, because the committee is going to put the ACC team ahead of them anyway, ultimately. So, but at least for a conversation standpoint, I could see it. The Georgia's the one that I'm very curious about. Because I'll say this, Trevor, I think the committee is going to have Georgia ahead of Notre Dame. I do. I agree with you on that one. The reason I could see them maybe not doing so is because of how convincingly Georgia lost. Like, that was not a competitive game, Trevor. It wasn't. It was not a competitive game. Now, the question then is, okay, are they going to then leap Ole Miss ahead of Notre Dame? And I don't think they'll do that. I don't. Because the thing about Ole Miss's losses, Ole Miss has a bad loss. They have a loss to a 3-6 team at home. That's a bad loss. So I don't think that they're going to do that. But, like, when you look at that game, Georgia was up. I mean, Ole Miss was up 16-7 at halftime. Never trailed the entire second half. Georgia scores to make it a 1-score game, and Ole Miss goes right back down the field and scores, and Georgia never really threatened again. And it wasn't even like Georgia moved the ball but turned it over a bunch. They turned it over a bunch and didn't move the ball. They only had 246 yards of offense. That was a butt whooping. That was a butt whooping. Ole Miss passed for more yards than Georgia had total offense in that game. So that was a whooping. And that's why I think I could see them, maybe that being the justification. Because here's the other thing. If you're going to have Georgia ahead of Notre Dame, you have to put Bama ahead of Notre Dame, because they now have an identical record and Georgia beat Bama. That's the worst case scenario for me, is that they not only leave Georgia ahead of Notre Dame, but they leave Bama ahead of Notre Dame also. That'd be worst case scenario for Notre Dame.
Yeah. Like I said, like I hope that I'm wrong, but I just, based on what the committee did in the first rankings, for me personally, I think they keep Notre Dame at 10. I think they keep both Georgia and Miami ahead of Notre Dame, and I think they swap BYU and Alabama. I do.
Yep. And
like I said, I hope that I'm wrong. But I just, until the committee is willing to show that like the Northern Illinois loss doesn't mean as much, like then I think that that's just kind of where Notre Dame's going to be camped out at, unfortunately.
Now, here's the thing though. We still don't we need to make sure we are not falling into the trap of viewing the committee the same way that we view the AP and coaches poll, because they have shown a willingness to move teams around even with wins. They have shown in the past willingness to flip teams because a team has a quality win. We saw that happen. Remember where Ohio State was in the first ranking that came out in 2014. They were like, what, 16th? They kept winning. 14th, and they kept winning and moving them up, right? Because they eventually got over that Virginia Tech loss because they went out and smacked people the rest of the way. So that's that. I mean, and the other thing too is, do they leave Army in the top 25? That's the other one, right? So we're going to learn more about the committee's view of teams tonight than we did last week. You know what I mean? Because now there's a lot more data, and because of the two big shakeups, 2 top 5 teams got beat this week. And then with one of them losing to a team that Notre Dame beat, that Louisville beat, like how does that – because that's what you're supposed to look at. You're supposed to look at the entirety of the season, not be reactionary to what happened recently. Will the committee do that or not? That's what we don't know. And so that's going to be a very interesting aspect of it. I still find it disgusting that Ward Manuel's in charge of it, but, it is what it is. But I'm very curious to see how – I think we're going to learn so much, like I said, so much more about this weekend than we did last week. Last week was like, okay, here's an early gauge. We're going to have 5 of these. So, here's where we're starting. Here's a starting point. How much shakeup do we see from week to week? That's going to be really, really interesting. And tonight we're going to see that because, like I said, Trevor, I can understand where you're coming from based on what they did last week, right? And that's why I said the fact that I even thought about my worst-case scenario tells me that I have concerns about the fact that I think that there's a chance they not only leave Georgia ahead of them, but then also put Bama ahead of them is very much a cause for concern. And then, okay, so then Georgia goes and beats Tennessee next weekend. That doesn't guarantee that they're going to drop Tennessee behind them. Like, how much are they going to overhype the SEC? Like, the SEC is getting so much overhyping right now. I mean, and I want to point to, do I need to remind you guys again what happened to them out of conference? It wasn't pretty. It wasn't pretty. But that's where we are. So anyway, we'll see if there's some more upsets this weekend, Trevor. That's the thing we don't know is what are the upsets going to be this weekend? Because I did, but I know a lot of people didn't have. I picked Miami to win. But that's why I talked about it on Thursday. It's a big game. I think Miami could win. I had Georgia Tech as a touchdown under, like Miami won by a touchdown. But I said, if Haynes King plays, I think Georgia Tech can win this game. And if their defense plays the way that they did against Notre Dame, I think they can win this game as well. And we saw that Miami's not the dynamic offense that people think they are because they can get whipped up front by a big physical line. And that's what Georgia did to them. So we're going to find out. But like you look at the games on the slate this weekend, Texas plays at Arkansas. That's a very interesting game. Arkansas already has one upset this on the schedule this season. Bama plays Mercer. How is the committee going to view Purdue and Penn State this weekend now that Penn State and Notre Dame will have a common opponent? LSU plays at Florida. Does a Florida upset drop LSU out, which then saps away a big win from Bama and Ole Miss? How does that get handled? There's going to be some very, if Missouri drops out, if they lose to South Carolina this week, how does that get handled? Oregon has a really sneaky game with Wisconsin, sneaky in that they should smack Wisconsin, but it's is it a overlooking Wisconsin type of thing as they get ready for a matchup against Washington, a rival, 2 weeks later? Tennessee plays at Georgia. And that's the other thing too, Trevor, is I could see them dropping Georgia down below, and then next week when Georgia beats Tennessee, moving them right back up in front of them. Like, that's just, that's kind of how it'll be. So not any games that you look at and say, well, gee, I expect a lot of shakeups, but not a lot of people predicted Vanderbilt to beat Bama early in the year either. So there's a lot of that going on. So anyway, Trev, that's going to do it for this show. Why don't you do me a favor now that we're done, folks? Why don't you kick us out of here, man?
Yeah, you got it, man. Well, hey, good show today. Brian and I are going to have content rolling out all week, previewing the Notre Dame Virginia game and Senior Day on Saturday. But before we get out of here, folks, be sure to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit that notification bell. Be sure to share this podcast. Leave us a 5-star review. And as always, don't forget to go to boards.irishbreakdown.com for all the exclusive content. So for Brian, I'm Trev. We'll see you back here tonight for the college football playoff show at Irish Breakdown.